I'd like to show you what so many commentators said about what the veil actually is, among other things, what the veil entailed from the 1500s all the way over to the early 1900s. I should grab a water bottle. Okay, I'm going to pause the recording 1 second. I'm going to grab a water bottle. Just 1 sec.
Hello, Nolan.
Hello.
Luke went to go get a water, I believe.
I'm
We're
back.
Okay,
gonna.
I was wondering
Uh,
why nobody was saying anything.
I'm
yeah.
back.
Oh, there you are.
Okay,
I thought it
guys.
was my audio.
No, we're sorry, Nolan. Okay, I'm sharing screens, guys. Okay, I'll tell you what, guys. You really don't need these quotes from a bunch of random people of a bunch of different denominations. But now we're adding a second reason why anyone who does not agree with the face veil, that this is what Paul is referring to, this is another reason why they'll be condemned if they don't accept it. Because as we have already said, the Jews, before Christ and even at the time of Christ and a little afterward, apparently, all veiled the face. They all practiced the seclusion of women, especially of virgin girls. And then married women, they would leave the house. They would go and do what they needed to do occasionally. But we see that these women would limit that kind of exposure of themselves to, like, after the sun had gone down, they would try not to do it in broad daylight. And we hear the church fathers saying that. I can even show some of those quotes. And that continued for so many centuries. I have a few just random quotes, but I tell you, I found some amazing quotes recently that I don't know if we're going to go over today, but just so much worldwide evidence of veiling going on over all the centuries, all around the world. But tonight we're just going to focus on Bible commentaries, and maybe on another night we'll go over all those. But there's so much time that really ought to go into researching that and bringing forward illustrations and lots of testimonies, not just from Christians, but from people who observe it and say, yeah, women are still veiling in the 1500s, 16, 17, 18, 1900s. Okay. I'll start then with, I'll tell you the little story, guys. Nolan looked up some commentary, or he found a commentary for me from some guy in the 1800s talking a commentary on 1 Corinthians 11. I just thought, I'm just curious. I wonder what this guy will say about face veiling. So he published this in 1886. Look how close that is to the 20th century. Very close. But I thought, I'll just check it just for fun. And shockingly, this is coming from a man living in England, in Wales, I believe. This is Thomas Charles Edwards. You can even pull up this little book here where it was published. It's got all that, 1800s font and everything. Very old. Well, lo and behold, listen to him. He says, for enjoining silence on the woman, which is here used to prove that she ought to veil her face, and therefore her subjection would be just as much a reason for silence in the smaller assemblies as in the larger ones. He's making the case that whether it's a large assembly or a small one, women should always be veiled. He says, third, it is remarkable that the conjunction, or the injunction, the command, to men to pray uncovered and to women to pray with veiled faces is peculiar to the Christians. And he says, among the Greeks, men and women prayed bareheaded. And he gives some quotes about that. He says, Plutarch says the Romans worshipped with the head covered, and among the Jews, the men veiled their faces in prayer. He's a little mixed up there. I've done a little bit more reading up than he has, because it wasn't just the Romans that worshipped with the head covered. It was the Greeks too. But yeah, look at two mentions of face veiling. He says, we must therefore suppose that we have here an example of a distinctly Christian observance that the men should pray without a headdress, the women with faces veiled. He says, women are enjoined to veil their faces if they pray or prophesy in the church assemblies. For three reasons. First, the veil is a symbol of the woman's subjection to the man in the Christian order. Second, it is a symbol of her subjection in the order of creation. Third, this symbolism is suggested by nature itself. As the man shames himself and Christ by veiling his face, so the woman shames herself and the man by worshiping with face unveiled. The woman that unveils her face in public worship shames herself. So you guys can see this guy's in the late 1800s. He is missing a lot of things. He is not agreeing with the early church as to why they veil. He doesn't understand this is just anytime you're in public, it's not just for worship. But do you notice how he sees this is a face veil? That is his understanding of it. Pretty shocking, huh? So in these commentaries, although they don't have the correct understanding of everything, I've got 50 commentaries all saying that this veil is a face veil. And we're not surprised that somebody in the 1800s, late 1800s, a Presbyterian no less, does not fully understand it. Well, let's jump around in dates. Here is Cornelius A. Lapide. I'm not sure how to say that, but he's a Catholic. He lives in Rome, and he's writing in the early 1600s. And he talks about the women in Corinth. He says, they were consequently wanton and forward to attract lovers by exposing their features and displaying their form. Now, he's about to explain what he means by exposing their features. That's talking about the face. And displaying their form means showing off their body. He says some of the Christians, whose minds were of a higher caste, advised St. Paul of this fact and put to him the question whether it was lawful or becoming for Christian women to go about with uncovered head, and especially in the church. See, guys, he has a better understanding of this because he's writing at an earlier time. He understands this isn't just about worship. And he says, Paul replies that it is neither becoming nor lawful. And he gives his reasons. The first is that the woman is subject to the man as her head, therefore she ought to be veiled. And I'm skipping around here. He says, on the other hand, it is disgraceful for a woman not to be veiled, for womanly honor and modesty require a woman to veil her head. See how he understands this is about modesty? He is writing in the 1600s. And remember, this is a Catholic. He makes some interesting theories here about praying and prophesying, what that refers to. And he just has an opinion which matches so many others. He matches all the early church that even though Paul says women should not pray or prophesy with an uncovered head, he's not actually saying they're even allowed to still pray and prophesy with a covered head. He goes on to talk about that later, but they're not allowed to speak in church at all. Women are to be silent in church, even according to this man's interpretation. And he says a little bit more here. He says, he quotes a lot of church fathers, pre and post Nicene, on the subject of what it means by the angels. This guy is ridiculous. He talks about what it means because of the angels. Now, guys, you got to understand, there came a point in church history, hundreds of years after Christ, where people, all the bishops started denying that the angels, or the sons of God who went into the daughters of men, is referring to angels, even though in the Septuagint it actually says the angels of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful. So it's even explicit. The Jews knew this is referring to the angels. But people started disbelieving this. And I know Augustine is one of those people who says, this is not referring to angels. He says, that's crazy. Angels would never do that with women, be attracted to women. And now you can't, it's almost impossible to find anybody in the mainstream churches, in the Catholic or Orthodox churches, that will say, yeah, this is this is angels coming down and sinning with the women. Nowadays they have this ridiculous theory that sons of God actually refers to good humans and daughters of men refers to bad humans, and that when they mingled, that just suddenly created giants on the earth. Makes no sense. But here's Lapide in the 1600s. Oh, by the way, guys, this is a very famous Catholic commentator. If you want to read his biography sometime, this is not some nobody. This is a big commentator up there alongside like George Leo Haydock, if you know who that is. That's one of their favorite Bible commentators. Now he says, because of the angels, the literal sense is that women ought to have a covering on the head out of reverence to the angels, not because angels have a body and can be provoked to lust, as Justin Martyr, Clement, and Tertullian thought. This is an error I exposed in my notes on Genesis 6. But rather, because angels are witnesses of the honest modesty or the immodesty of women. So at least he still understands this is about modesty. He says also,
Luke,
yes?
he mentions Justin. Is there a quote from Justin ever saying this?
There are tons of quotes of the church fathers talking about angels committing sin with women, but not necessarily
I know.
mentioning veiling.
I'm talking about, he mentions Justin as Justin, Clement, and Tertullian.
Yes, talking about
So,
the angels falling. Yes, all of them talk about the angels falling and sinning with the women because of their beauty.
oh, okay. I thought he was quoting these guys as talking about like the angels actually. Wait, I'm so confused. Never mind.
Y-
Never mind. Never mind. I'm
It's okay.
sorry.
I think I know what you mean, though, because you were thinking about veiling. No, they don't mention
Yeah.
veiling, but they do mention all the church fathers. You could probably find easily 100 quotes from the Ante-Nicene church period, from like easily 30 or 40 church fathers, all confirming that angels literally came down and fornicated with women. That was the universal view. But then later on, they started denying that. It's almost because they just became more atheistical in their thinking. They'll believe that the statues of Mary are all crying and communicating something, but they'll say, angels taking on human form? That's impossible. How's that possible? But there's Mary floating around performing miracles in my imagination. So, can you believe the audacity? He says, this is an error I exposed in my notes on Genesis 6. Wow, Lapita, you are powerful. You just destroyed the whole early church and the Jewish belief for centuries and the Septuagint. Wow, no one can stop you. He says this is rather because angels are witnesses of the honest modesty or immodesty of women, as also of their obedience or disobedience. He says, so John Chrysostom, Theophylact, Theodoret, St. Thomas Aquinas, Anselm, and Clement of Alexandria understand by angels good and holy men. And that is correct, guys. This is not a contradiction to say that when he says because of the angels, this is also referring to men in the church. That is true. Sisters, when you veil yourself, it is because of men in the church. Because remember, even the angels were men. That's why they fell into sin, because when they took on human bodies, they also partook of human lust. So if you understand that even the angels fell into sin because of the beauty of women being openly displayed, how much more should you veil yourself because of men in the church? You see, there is no contradiction between Tertullian, Justin, Clement versus Chrysostom, Theophylact, and Theodoret, and Clement of Alexandria.
I love that interpretation too.
Yes,
It's
no
amazing.
contradiction. And he continues. He says, now Ambrose, Anselm, and Thomas Aquinas take it to mean priests and bishops. Okay, this is not a contradiction. You don't want to be tempting the clergy in the church with your beauty. And he says, hence Clement of Alexandria thinks that this bids them cover not merely their head, but also their forehead and face, as we see the more honorable do in church. This is in the 1600s, guys. He says they cover forehead and face. This is a Catholic. So Catholic women were doing this. Now we know there were some less honorable, there were some unrighteous women who weren't doing it. But do you see? This was a practice in the churches. We're going to see this in all the denominations. He continues, he's quoting lots of church fathers still all throughout this thing. He says, so neither... Oh, he talks about, he says, Clement of Alexandria says that it is a reproach to the Spartans that they wore their dress down to the knee only. The women doing that. So neither are their maidens to be praised for going forth in public with unveiled face, for in that way maiden modesty was lost by being put up for sale. They understood that, guys, to be, they would call it prostitution. If women just showed themselves to people for free, they're like, wow, you're like a prostitute. Don't be just giving that away. That's something to hide. It's very precious. Don't show your beauty to everybody. He says, Tertullian blames those women who used a thin veil because it was a provocation to lust rather than a protection to modesty. And he says that even the Gentile women were doing it. He says Tertullian wrote a treatise on this very point to prove that all women, married or unmarried, religious or secular, should be veiled, any custom to the contrary notwithstanding, because so the apostle enjoins. And he says even the Corinthian women of his day understand that women are to be veiled. He says, moreover, the reasons given by the apostle apply to all women alike, so that any breach of the precept ought to be censured and corrected. In some places, maidens go abroad with a head wholly uncovered to show their beauty and attract a husband, when all that they really do is to peril the chastity of themselves and others, and to expose themselves daily to the wiles of panders. And hence we see and hear of so many shipwrecks to chastity. Let then a maiden be veiled, and go abroad covered, lest she see herself when she ought not, or others be too much attracted to her features. You can see now what he means by this. He is endorsing that veil, which he says the honorable women in the church still wear, talking about a face veil. And he's quoting the church fathers on it, who all understand it to be the face veil. He says, hence Tertullian says every public display of a maiden is a violation of her chastity, no doubt meaning that anyone who walks about freely with roving eyes and exposed face to see and be seen is easily robbed of the purity of her mind. St. Paul, therefore, is not laying down any rule, but merely points to the teaching of nature that it is fitting for a woman, when she goes out in public, to go with bonnet and veil. So they would wear, again, like the two-piece guys. They would have the hood and face covering. He says, but not for a man. Still, he here adopts the decency taught by nature and wishes the Corinthians to observe it as if it were a precept, etc., etc. So that's two. We've got a Presbyterian and a Catholic. Presbyterian in the late 1800s understands it's face veil, but he doesn't understand that it's for modesty, not just for worship. But Lapide is very close to what we all understand, although arrogant about denying what it means that because of the angels. And again, wants to pit the church fathers against each other as if they contradict each other. Isn't that also very arrogant? We do not do that. We seek to reconcile what the church fathers say. Nolan points out it's very important to the incarnation that we believe the angels tried to come down and teach us, because where they failed, Christ succeeded. Exactly. You see how this actually brings glory to Christ, that he did what even the angels failed to do. It makes Jesus' mission even more amazing and maybe riskier if you're watching from the outside and you don't know that Jesus is going to win. You're like, well, Jesus is going to try it now. Will Jesus overcome them? And yeah, he did. He was the one who lived perfectly righteously when even God's angels couldn't do it. Or you could say they failed to. They could have, but they succumbed to weakness and the temptation was great. All right, now we're going to read a commentary from John Lightfoot, a very famous commentator who is a Puritan living in England. And he has a book called Hebrew and Talmudical Exercitations upon the First Epistle to the Corinthians. I've got the links if anybody wants to read these. He says, from hence it may be, oh, and by the way, writing in the late 1600s. He says, from whence it may be readily gathered that men and women should not so promiscuously and confusedly meet and sit together, nor that they should so look upon one another as in the courts of the temple and at Jerusalem, when such innumerable multitudes flock to the feasts, but that women should sit by themselves, divided from the men, where they might hear and see what is done in the synagogue, yet they themselves remain out of sight. Which custom Baronius proves at large, and not amiss, that those first churches of the Christians retained. He says, when the women therefore did thus meet apart, it is no wonder if they took off the veils from their faces when they were now out of the sight of men, and the cause of their veiling being removed, which indeed was that they might not be seen by men. This is his commentary on 1 Corinthians. This is in the context. So he talks about what Christians used to do, what Jews also used to do. And he says when women meet apart, then they take off their veils because they're not around men. They're out of the sight of men. You guys understand? This is about modesty. So here they are in the 1600s understanding that. He says the apostle treats not of wives alone, but of women in general, whether they were wives, virgins, or widows. But the sense arises higher. A man praying covered, as ashamed of his face before God, disgraces his head, Christ, who himself carried the like face of a man. Especially he disgraces the office of Christ, by whom we have access to God with confidence. And a woman praying not veiled, as if she were not ashamed of her face, disgraces man, her head, while she would seem so beautiful beyond him, when she is only the glory of the man, but the man is the glory of God. So she's the glory of man, man is the glory of God. She gives proper honor to her husband by covering herself and letting him be the one who's visible while she is hidden. That should be sufficient, but he has a few more quotes. He says, but if any woman were so unmindful or forgetful, why the veil of her hair was granted her by nature. So he's saying the veil of her hair, meaning her hair being a veil. Why her hair, which is a veil, was granted her by nature, and so much assured of her beauty and her face, as when she prays to take off her veil, the sign of her reverence toward God. I know it's a long sentence. Maybe I should read that one more time. He says, but if any woman was so unmindful or forgetful, why the veil of her hair was granted her by nature, and so much assured of her beauty and her face, as when she prays to take off her veil, the sign of her reverence toward God, Let her take off also, says he, that natural sign of reverence, the veil of her hair. Yeah, so in other words, long story short, abbreviation is just, he's saying if you're not going to wear that artificial veil, then you might as well get rid of your long hair, because they both serve the same purpose. And all people know that a long hair on a woman is fitting. But women just don't use it properly. And as you guys know, the Mennonites, they like to bind it up. And they're like, yeah, I've bound up my hair on the back of my head. It's serving the purpose. Well, you might as well have short hair then. You don't understand. Long hair is a glory to a woman because it can fall down and veil her. It can cover her whole head, even her face. Okay, sorry. He keeps going. He says, I would render his words in this sense. So he's saying if I could take this passage because of the angels, and I could render it my own way, he says, I would render Paul's words in this sense. A woman in the public assembly of the church ought to have her face veiled because of the devils, namely that they ensnare not men by the appearance of the beauty of women's faces, and provoke them to gaze upon their faces, and to behold them with lascivious eyes, while they ought rather to look up to heaven and to be intent upon divine things. So he's saying he thinks it's because of the evil angels. Perhaps he's thinking of the evil angels who fell because of women. But in any case, guys, he's still saying this is about the beauty of women's faces. Somebody tell me if I read it wrong. Some of these sentences are really long sentences. He says, but now, although the canons of the masters required and the custom of the nation approved the veiling of women's faces in the streets, he says, yet it was permitted women to bare their faces, to adorn them, and to beautify them at marriage time, as the rabbis teach. So he's been reading some Talmudic stuff. In the Talmud, they do say, yeah, on your marriage day, go ahead and you can take it off and beautify yourself. Christians did not approve of that. That's a post-Christian thing. Nope. You guys see? It's all about modesty. He continues, her hair is given her for a covering. The daughters of Nicodemus being reduced to miserable poverty, so he's giving a story from the Talmud. He's talking about hair, how hair is a covering. He says the daughter of Nicodemus being reduced to miserable poverty, going to Rabbi Yochanan to speak to him, veiled herself with her hair and stood before him. The poor woman had no other veil. Therefore she used that which was given her by nature, and she used it, shall I say, as a sign, or as an instrument and mark of modesty and shamefacedness. So here's an example of a woman using her hair in the appropriate way that it was supposed to be used. In fact, maybe this is a good time to bring up the story of Agnes. So Augustine tells the story of Agnes. She died in 304. This is before the Council of Nicaea. This is an interesting story, guys. Agnes, Saint Agnes, she's just a young girl. After she refused to sacrifice to the Roman god Vesta, was said to have been stripped naked by the order of the prefect, but no sooner had her garments fallen than her hair grew miraculously and enveloped her in a shroud, or as in a shroud. According to Mennonites, this concept sounds, extremely immodest because her hair is being shown. But see, guys, Augustine tells this story and he makes it clear God did this, he made this miracle happen, and it was to show them, you guys are committing a great sin by taking this righteous virgin and stripping her and treating her this way. So I'm going to perform a miracle to shame all of you. She'll be veiled with her natural covering, which is her hair. And her hair grew really long, covered her whole body, and they stopped what they were doing. So guys, again, this is just silly that the Mennonites think that hair needs to be covered. They would think, hair on her whole body. This is terrible. What are we going to do? She needs to cut off all that hair, or she needs to bind it up on her head. You guys see how wicked that is? I'm not even going to say anything else. So ridiculous, these people. Hair is a covering. Hair does not need to be covered. Okay, we're going to keep going. We've done a few. We've done Lightfoot. That was his commentary. He lives in the late 1600s. Let's go to another commentary. This is Joseph Mead. Again, guys, I found a lot of these. I found almost all of them, actually, from that website Study Light. And so they were taking all the best commentaries they could find online. They're taking famous ones. So these are not just nobodies. Joseph Mead is a very famous Protestant commentator from the early 1600s. And he was against Calvinism. He was a Protestant, and he was living in England. Somebody have anything they wanted to say? No? Okay, I'm going to keep going. Should I be checking the comments here? Okay, he says, among other things, He's giving reasons why Paul wrote the letter. He says, secondly, concerning the nature of the fault, it was this. The women at the time of praying and prophesying in the church were appearing unveiled. At that time, it was widely regarded as unseemly and immodest for women to appear open-faced and bare in public. And he says, you may wonder, how could it happen that Christian women would so completely forget themselves as to violate this standard of decorum in God's house and during his worship, even though they observed it elsewhere? See, guys, they were already veiling elsewhere, but they were taking it off during the worship. And again, I already showed you guys, the church taught that women used to do this. Well, we know from history, Greek and Roman women used to do this. They used to unveil themselves whenever they were praying or offering sacrifice. But Mede is about to confirm that. Joseph says, I answer, this practice arose from a fanciful imitation of the practices of female priests and prophetesses among the Gentiles. When these women served their idols, as seen in Pythia or Bacchae or Maenides and others, they would put themselves into wild and ecstatic states. Their faces were uncovered, their hair disheveled, and it hung loosely around their heads as they uttered oracles or performed the rites and sacrifices of their gods. These Corinthian women, imagining themselves to be like these she-priests when they prayed or prophesied in the church, began to imitate their behavior. They saw themselves as acting the part of Pythia, sibyls, or priestesses of the Bacchic and Menadic rites. Consequently, being prone to follow fashion, as is often the case with women, they cast off their veils and exposed their faces immodestly in the congregation. You guys see how it's about modesty? In doing so, they dishonored their heads, as the apostle says. That is, they dressed themselves in an unseemly manner, particularly regarding the appearance of their heads. And then he gives more arguments for why Paul is rebuking them. He says, and number 3, this is the third reason. Well, okay, I'll go through them. He says, Paul says, nature has given women hair as a natural covering, which itself teaches them to be covered as a sign of submission. Number 2, from custom, it was taught that the manner of covering is determined by the customs of the nations. And number 3, Paul rebukes them from an argument by comparison. The apostle argues from the example of men. If it would be considered unseemly for a man to wear a veil, since that is a woman's attire, then by the same reasoning it is justly and as unseemly for a woman to be without a veil, as this would be to dress like a man. I think that should be sufficient. Yes. Okay, we go on to another. It's a lot, isn't it, guys? So you probably think 50 commentaries, Luke. Do you really need to give 50? Well, I have some surprises in here from some people you're probably not expecting. Here's Charles Hodge. He's writing, he was born in 1797 and died in 1878. So this guy is actually really close to the 1900s when he's writing this. He's a Presbyterian living in the United States. Now, guys, in the U.S., they were forgetting this stuff. By the beginning of the 20th century, they were starting to forget about veiling. But still, listen to what he says. The Corinthians, in violation of public sentiment and the custom of all the churches, allowed women to appear unveiled. Abram, I'm going to have to mute you. Can you hear me? It's a little loud, Abram.
Oh, sorry.
You're okay. Might just have to mute. Okay. He says the Corinthian women, in violation of public sentiment and the customs of all the churches, allowed women to appear unveiled. He says the veil was the conventional symbol of that subordination. For a woman to appear in public unveiled was to renounce her position and forfeit the respect due to her sex. Paul does not merely say it was wrong for Grecian women to appear in public unveiled. Rather, he unfolds the principles valid for all time. He says the principle emphasized in this paragraph is that women should conform in matters of dress to the usages that the public sentiment of the community in which they live demands. So again, he's not completely correct about that. No, you should be modest according to God's standard of modesty. Remember, God set up the rule that women should veil because man was made first and woman was made for man, and because of the angels, and also because nature itself teaches you. That's not necessarily, just you now have permission to unveil yourself if you live in an evil society. And I think he is kind of saying that. Again, guys, USA, late 1800s, he's not going to have the correct view. But still, listen, he knows that it's a face veil. He says the veil in all Eastern countries was, and to a great extent still is, the symbol of modesty and subjection. For a woman, therefore, in Corinth, to discard the veil was to renounce her claim to modesty and to refuse to recognize her subordination to her husband. If the veil was discarded as the symbol of subordination, it must also be discarded as the symbol of modesty. And he says, just as it is disgraceful for a woman, or just as it is disgraceful for a man to appear in the costume of a woman, so it is disgraceful for a woman to appear in the costume of a man. And he says, the custom that Paul censured or criticized was contrary to the universal practice of the Christians. And he says the veils worn by Grecian women, women from Greece, were of different kinds. One, and perhaps the most common, was the peplos, or mantle, which in public was thrown over the head and enveloped the whole person. The other was more in the fashion of the common Eastern veil, which covered the face with the exception of the eyes. In one form or another, the custom was universal for all respectable women to appear veiled in public. The apostle therefore says that a woman who speaks in public with her head uncovered dishonors her head. And he says the issue to be corrected was women appearing in public assemblies unveiled. Blah, 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 blah. So there it is. He says, now listen to what he says, comparing it with their own practice in the USA in the late 1800s. He says, the instinctive sense of propriety in an Eastern maiden prompts her, when surprised by strangers, to cover her face. In a European, it would not produce that effect. In writing, therefore, to Eastern females, it would be correct to ask whether their native sense of propriety did not prompt them to cover their heads in public. The response would infallibly be yes. Again, another person testifying this is a face veil. They knew it very recently. Here is another guy. He's an Anglican. That means he's with the Church of England. And he is writing in actually the early 1900s. He's living in Wales, which is next to England. And this is from a book called the Cambridge Greek Testament Commentary for Schools and Colleges. Again, this is a big commentary I found online. This is not some small one. This is some big thing released by Cambridge University. And it says, it was the custom of the Jews that they prayed not unless first their heads were veiled, and that for this reason, that by this rite they might show themselves reverent and ashamed before God, and unworthy with an open face to behold him. You guys see how it confirms what I was saying? That somebody who's ashamed covers their face. And they go over each verse here in the passage of 1 Corinthians 11. But every woman that prays or prophesies, etc. And they say this refers, of course, to the public assemblies of the church, where the woman appears, not in her individual character, but as the member of a community. See, guys, they understand. This is talking about when you're in public, not in private. Doesn't matter what you're doing in private. She must therefore perform her devotions in this latter character, and her attire must bear witness to the fact that she is subordinate to those of the other sex in whose presence she worships. Alone, of course, or in the presence of her own sex only, she has the same privilege of approaching God unveiled that man has. And they say, in the fifth argument, an appeal is now made to our natural feeling of what is proper and becoming. Man, as his sphere is the world, and as he is the highest of God's creatures in it, needs no covering to hide him from the gaze of others. Woman, as her sphere is the home, and as being, whether married or unmarried, under the dominion of man, receives of God's providence the covering of her long hair, whereby she may veil herself from the gaze of those who are not her natural protectors. You see, guys, how long hair is supposed to come down and act as a veil? Here's David Dickinson living in the mid-1600s. He wrote a commentary. He's a Presbyterian, but he's from Scotland. These commentaries are all over the place. He's commentating on 1 Corinthians 11. He says, it is apparent that the Corinthians did not sufficiently observe this order, as their women, in public assemblies, after the manner of the heathens, laid aside their veils, and the men covered their heads and faces. You guys tell me if this is too many commentaries, but, somebody called us insane. We've had a few comments saying, we're insane to believe this is a face veil. Can you believe it? I'm going to keep going because of that. He says in argument number 2, it is dishonorable for the female sex to lay aside her veil. Therefore, the woman is here reproved for her indecency, which she ought to amend. See, guys, this is about being decent in public. It's not talking about some mystical thing going on. The reason a woman veils isn't for some weird mystical reason. It is because of modesty. He continues, she ought to profess subjection to him by covering herself. Therefore, since the woman behaves otherwise among you, she is blamed for indecency. And argument number 9, he says, if anyone should not be moved by these arguments, but should still contend, the apostle opposes their contentious apologies with the established custom of the Jews and the rest of the churches. No other churches have the custom that women should be present in public assemblies with their heads uncovered. So notice how this is just being in public, not just praying and prophesying. Here's a Calvinist living in Italy in the early to mid 1600s. His commentary says, though there were in both those things great defects in the Corinthians, that evil came rather from some particular persons than from the whole body, which was yet found faithful and dutiful to the apostle. I highlighted that because I found it interesting that somebody for once is not bashing the Corinthian church like people bash them today. Nowadays, they make it sound like the whole church that Paul is writing to, they're all just a complete mess. But really, Paul is always writing to a select few in the church who are causing trouble. It's not like the entire church is in ruins or these entire assemblies in each city are just a total mess. It's individuals that are causing problems. Here in the verse 3 commentary, he says, a new precept, or one renewed by the apostle, concerning common civility for dress, namely that women in public assemblies of the church should be covered, and men should have their heads uncovered. See, guys, this is just the common civility for dress. And he says, on the verse where Paul says, anybody praying or prophesying with something, if a man does that with something on his head, he dishonors himself. He says, but the woman should do it covered. He says, covered, meaning so that his face is covered, which was the manner of covering women were accustomed to use. Face veil, guys, face veil. I won't read the whole thing. You probably get the picture. I can post this somewhere else. Here is Desiderius Erasmus. He's very similar. He says the same thing. This is even more so since through him God's glory is set forth, which should not be covered. On the other side, as the woman is subject to her husband, so she is attired for his honor. Against him she may rightly be counted as disgraceful if by uncovering her head in public places she shows her own shamelessness, and as though she were free, refuses obedience to her husband. See, she's supposed to show shame. In other words, covering her face. He says, just as Christ is honored if the man serves him and proclaims his glory with an uncovered head, so the husband is honored if his wife with reverence, silence, and modest apparel shows a sober obedience in herself. Modest apparel, guys. This is about modesty. He says, and if any woman is so far past shame that she disregards the sight of men, yet for the sake of the angels, let her head be covered. See how this is about being exposed to the sight of a man? For to her nature has given a thicker and fuller growth of hair than to the man, so that she, being subject to her husband, might never lack a natural veil. Now, I didn't highlight anything in purple there because he didn't specifically mention the face, but I think it's pretty obvious. Here's John Wesley, the founder of the Methodist Church. You want to know something amazing, guys? I don't just have commentaries here from various prominent Bible commentators and famous pastors. I have the founders of denominations. I'm about to show you John Wesley, the founder of the entire Methodist Church in the 1700s. And what does he say in his commentary? He says, every man praying or prophesying refers to speaking by the immediate power of God, and he says, with his head and face covered, either with a veil or with long hair, dishonors his head. He says, St. Paul seems to mean, as in these Eastern nations veiling the head is a badge of subjection, so a man who prays or prophesies with a veil on his head reflects a dishonor on Christ, whose representative he is. Face veil. He says, but every woman who under an immediate impulse of the Spirit, for then only was a woman suffered to speak in the church, prays or prophesies without a veil on her face, as it were, disclaims subjection, and reflects dishonor on man her head. For it is the same in effect as if she cut her hair short, and wore it in the distinguishing form of the men. In those ages men wore their hair exceedingly short, as appears from the ancient statues and pictures. Face veil. Okay, we're going to keep going. Who's next? John Colet, a Catholic living in England in the late 1400s. Wow, this is an old commentary. He says, now when St. Paul is teaching the Corinthians, what St. Paul is teaching the Corinthians is a lesson on what is decent and becoming in the way of dress for each sex when in church. Namely, in the Christian assembly, consisting of men and women, the latter should have their heads covered. He shows that nature itself prompts women to let their hair grow, and that our customs ought to imitate nature, the best mistress. Women ought purposely to cover that which nature would have covered. He would have it be a token of subjection in women, whose nature designs to be subject to their husbands, as the body is to the head. The veil, he implies, is an emblem of that subjection. And he says, not even Jesus Christ himself, insofar as he is a man, is subject, he says, nay, even Jesus Christ himself, insofar as he is man, is subject to God. All, moreover, are veiled, not with a material veil, the sign of obedience and subjection, but with that which is symbolized by the veil, even obedience itself, the true veil of the mind. So he's speaking symbolically, just as Paul does. And he says, in his sight, all beings must have the veil of obedience on the head of their mind, even Jesus himself, insofar as he is man. Before Jesus, again, men must be shrouded by the veil of obedience and subjection, and before men, women. But in the present passage, St. Paul is dealing with a custom that deserved attention as it raised the question of what was becoming in an assembly of men and women. And he points out the superiority of the man and the subjection of the woman, as shown in the matter of headdress. He teaches authoritatively that women should be covered in church and men uncovered. I didn't highlight any purples in there about it being face veil, but he does say that the custom should be followed, that having a big bunch of hair is something from nature that tells you the whole head should be covered, and that includes the face. It's pretty obvious. Also, he refers to that veil of Moses, which is a face veil. Okay, here's another founder of a denomination, Alexander Campbell, who was born in 1788 and died in 1866. Here I'm going to scroll down to this quote first from from one of his articles that he wrote. He had this very famous publication that he would send out to all the surrounding regions. They like to read Alexander's little tractates and commentaries. He says, 2 sovereigns cannot sit on one throne, nor control one domain. A body with 2 heads is usually called a monster. He talks about women. He says women today are seeking too many rights. They want to participate in political and ecclesiastical office. And he says they want to usurp the authority of men. He says, the sex is constitutionally, legally, and religiously modest and retiring in the presence of him whom God made first. He says, nor would an apostle who commanded and importuned them to be chaste, keepers at home, obedient to their own husbands, to adorn themselves with modest apparel, with good works, with a meek and quiet spirit, who commanded them to marry, to raise and educate children, and to teach their junior women to follow their example in similar pursuits. Nor, he says, Paul would not contradict himself and stultify his own wisdom and discretion by telling them at the same time that they had political or civil rights and duties incompatible with these, calling them off into the busy circles of the forum or the battlefield or the tumultuous cabals and controversies of men. And he says, Paul, that would have women to veil their own faces even in the synagogue and to wear long hair for a covering in Christian assemblies, could not have made it either a duty, a privilege, or an honor to claim the rights of a civil magistrate, lawgiver, blah, blah, blah. Face veil. He says Paul had them veil their faces. But with a superlative modesty and delicacy, he inhibits them from asking a curious question, even in a religious assembly, and charges the ministers of the church to cause their women, their wives and their daughters, to keep silence in the churches. And Alexander Campbell, again, the founder of the Church of Christ denomination, which has a few million members, he gave a speech to some women in a female seminary. And he gives quite a speech. I'll just read the last part of it. It's much longer than what I have here. But he told these women they should not be doing this. He told them they should not be going out and doing public missionary work. Listen to what he tells them. This is pretty bold to say to a female seminary when that's the whole point of their existence, is to prepare women to do that kind of service. He says, there is no necessity for you women to mount the rostrum, which just means like a podium, to stand up in public assemblies, to address mixed authorities of both sexes, of all classes and of all orders of society, in order to fill up the duties of your mission. So he says, you women, you have a special mission from God that does not include these other things. And he says, if Paul would not have a woman to pray unveiled in a Christian church, and if he made long hair a glory to her because it veiled her beauty and protected her eyes from the gaze of staring sensualists, do you think he would have sent her out on a missionary tour or placed her in a rostrum, surrounded by ogling eyes in the hands not of old men and women of dim vision, but in the hands of young men? He says, green striplings of pert impertinence. Be assured, not one word of such import ever fell from the lips of prophets or apostles. On the contrary, modesty, shamefacedness, and sobriety are the garland of beauty, the wreath of glory, and the corona of dignity. That just means a crown. A corona of dignity and honor on the person of a Christian woman who is always in her proper sphere an elect lady, not necessarily of the aristocracies of earth, but of the elite and honorable of heaven, etc., etc. He's clearly talking about a face veil. I even went on this one website. It has a Church of Christ author on it. He says, wow, this guy Alexander Campbell sure is strict. He says there is no need, according to Campbell, for women to preach or teach publicly in order to fulfill their purpose and mission. For support, he appeals to 1 Corinthians 11 on the veiling of woman's head and face from staring sensualists. Blah, blah, blah. So, guys, I'm not the only one who understands Campbell's talking about a face veil here. So that's 2 face veil quotes from Alexander Campbell. Here is William Greenhill, an Anglican in England. He lived in the late 1600s. He says they, the angels, reverence the greatness and majesty of Christ. Though they be high and glorious, yet they see so vast a distance between Christ and themselves that they cover their faces. And he says, women are to be veiled in the assemblies because of the angels, to show their reverence and subjection to them being present. And angels are covered to show their reverence and subjection unto Christ. It is an honor to the angels that in reverence to them, the women are to be veiled. So he's saying women should be veiled just like the angels veil their faces in the presence of Christ. And she, being in the presence of a man, does the same thing. Here's James Durham, another Protestant. I couldn't figure out his denomination. I probably could have looked a little farther, but I was in a hurry. He writes in the late 1700s or perhaps early 1800s. Oh, did I not highlight anything in here? Let's see here. Hence the Apostle Paul enjoins modest apparel with shamefacedness and sobriety or chastity, as also does the Apostle Peter. Let's see here. He says, we read of old and such as were grave, that they covered themselves with a veil. And in 1 Corinthians 11, married women going abroad uncovered is looked on as unnatural. You guys notice how he understands going abroad uncovered. It's not about praying or prophesying. These people understand this is about modesty. He says, what would such say if they lived in our times? We are persuaded the gravest among women are most averse from this evil. So he's saying they don't do this evil. And the lightest are most prone and given to it. So he's saying some women do go out unveiled. And seeing all women should be grave, it must import a disclaiming of that qualification where this lightness is delighted in. So he's saying, in other words, these women who act all, silly like this, going out in public unveiled, he's saying that is something that should be criticized. If therefore there be any shame, if there be any conscience, we will expect to prevail with some who are touched with a sense of gravity, that they may be good examples to the rest, and once endeavor effectually to bring gravity and modest shamefacedness in fashion again. Wow, so he's saying they're struggling. They're having a problem with this in the late 1700s or early 1800s. What else does he say? He has a few quotes in here. I probably should spend some more time on this and highlight it. It was a very difficult thing to... it was in this old book, guys, and it was very blurry. I had to write it out myself. I couldn't copy and paste it. That's why it's a little messy. He says, it is also worthy the noticing that Tertullian has to this purpose in his book on the apparel of women, chapter 7, where having expostulated with Christian women for their various vain dressing of the hair, he bespeaks them thus: "Drive away this bondage of busking from a free head. In vain do you labor to appear thus dressed. In vain do you make use of the most expert frizzlers of hair. God commands you to be covered and veiled." So he's appealing to Tertullian, guys. Did Tertullian teach a face veil? Does anybody know? The answer is yes. So that's why I included this in this list. I wonder if he has any more explicit ones. We'll be here all night. Even Nolan's staying. Nolan, I know this is long, but hey, we were called insane. We got to read a bunch. We gotta overwhelm them with quotes here. Let's see here. I'll just read this purple part. Oh, he's talking about the commendations, the compliments that Solomon is giving to his wife. He says to her that her eyes are beautiful within her veil. He translates "within your veil." I think he's going by the Masoretic, perhaps, which is not so explicit about the veil and what it is. I think it refers to the hair, even her hair as being a veil. So he says these eyes are within her locks, meaning within her hair. And he says locks are that part of the hair that hangs about the face, handsomely knit, and was then, instead of a veil, to women. Well, at least he understands that hair can veil a face. I don't know, though, if Solomon's wife is veiling her face with hair, though. I thought that she was wearing a real veil. In any case, he says, Paul keeps commending her for her beauty, blah, blah, blah. He says the second commendation is that these temples, her face, are within her locks, and they're of the color of pomegranate, but not discernible fully, as the eyes also were in verse 1. Yet something observable, as sometimes modesty will make blushing, and again will seek to cover it, when hardly will it be gotten done. So he's just emphasizing here that the veil on Solomon's wife's face is covering her face, and that her hair is also acting as a veil. This is in support of what we've been saying, because we've been saying hair is a veil. Nobody believes us about that. People used to understand that. He says, veil. Okay, he's commenting on the verse where it says, the watchmen took the veil away from Solomon's wife. They attacked her. We don't know if that actually happened or if it's just them speaking symbolically, but in any case, yeah, it says the watchman took away this woman's veil. And he says this has a threefold meaning, or the veil has a threefold use. Number 1, for decoration. Number 2, for a sign of modesty, pleaded for by the apostle in 1 Corinthians 11. And number 3, mainly for a sign of women's subjection to their own husbands, for which cause Rebekah puts on her veil when she meets Isaac. Okay, guys, if he says this veil that Rebekah put on is the same one that Paul's referring to in 1 Corinthians 11, it's a face veil, because that's what Rebekah put on. Nobody denies that was a face veil. I'm going to have to skip over Spurgeon because I have not found enough quotes from him yet, but we'll come back to him. Here's Frédéric Godet. He's a Protestant living in Switzerland, and he was born in 1812 and died in 1900. That's really late, guys. If he's just talking about a face veil, that should be shocking to people. That is so late. Very recent. He says, a feeling of holy modesty ought to constrain her to secure herself from every indiscreet and profane look. For the very reason that she is speaking to God, she ought in this sacred act to veil her figure from the eyes of men. You see, guys, this is about other men looking at the woman. That's what they all say. Oh, where did this idea come from that this is some symbolic thing you just plop on your head? So weird. He says, by not giving the man long hair like the woman's, nature itself has shown that an uncovered head and an open brow, that's on the face, suit his dignity as king of creation. By giving to the woman a covering of hair which envelops her in a manner from head to foot, nature itself has shown that it is suitable to her to withdraw as much as possible from view and to remain concealed. Etc., etc. I could read the whole thing, but look, it's getting late. It's almost 11. Okay, here's Henry Ainsworth. He is a separatist from the Anglican Church, writing in the early 1600s. And he quotes on this section, which I haven't even put on the website. It's from Genesis 24, when Abimelech returns Sarah back to Abraham, who he had taken away. He had taken away Sarah. And then when he realized that she was married, he gave her back. And he says this weird thing. He says, Sarah, your husband is a veil to your eyes. He says, he is to you a veil for the eyes. A strange statement. I didn't include it in my list of verses because, I'm not sure what that means exactly. But look, this guy takes a stab at it at explaining what that means. That her husband is a veil to her eyes. He says, he is to thee a covering for the eyes. That is, he is and shall be your husband to defend you from injury, and to whom you must profess subjection. For the covering of the eyes and face with a veil was a sign of the woman's subjection to the man and of his power over her. Etc., etc. He says more, but I'll just continue. I think that should act as enough. Here is a Puritan writing in 1688. We know when this was published. His name is Thomas Wall. So 1688, he says, the men in the Church of Corinth did not only wear a womanish length of hair, but they also wore on their heads women's veils, so that in reproving them, both the apostle teaches, saying, in reproving them both, the apostle teaches, saying, every man praying or prophesying with his head covered dishonors his head. That is, he dishonors his head, Christ. This is not meant in wearing a cap or the like, for God's ministers of old wore such in the service of God, yet they broke not God's order in nature. See, that's such a good point, guys. Do you remember the men in the Old Testament, the priests, they wore hats while they performed God's service and prayed? Was that breaking the law of men not being allowed to veil when praying or prophesying? Of course that was not breaking the law. You see, guys, if you have a Protestant, ridiculous, modern mindset, then you think that God is just changing his mind randomly. Oh, well, he allowed them to wear, he even commanded them to wear these hats or even crowns when they're doing the priestly service, but now that's not allowed. Or if you're a Protestant Catholic, you say, well, it actually is allowed and Paul's crazy. Or, guys, you can have the correct Christian mindset and understand Paul and God never forbade men to have just a thing on the top of their head when they're praying or prophesying. What God did forbid, what Paul forbade, is men veiling their faces like a woman in public. And in the presence of a woman, while his woman next to him takes off her veil. That is disgraceful. A man veiling while his woman is unveiled in public. That's what Paul is saying is sinful and wicked. But a woman being unveiled in private is not a sin. Just like a man being veiled, like let's say you guys were captured and somebody wrapped up your face or something, or let's just use an example. Let's say you're out in the blizzard, it's freezing cold out there, and let's say you have a big face veil, like you have covered yourself to shield you from the freezing wind. You've got a face veil. Oh no. Can you pray? Of course you can pray. That's not what Paul is condemning. He's talking about dress. Women should be veiled around men. Men should not be unveiling or doing this, men should not be veiling themselves around a woman. That is ridiculous. It was a Greek and Roman practice that Paul was rebuking, and not really anybody does that today. Everybody understand that? Anybody have any questions about that?
Actually, well, so just to clarify, so like a woman in private can pray with her head uncovered, but the point is that she's not around people that can see her.
Right. The whole point of having a veil in the first place is being around men, so that men don't see you. You veil yourself. But if she's by herself, it doesn't matter if she has a veil or not.
Okay, and like you're saying, so likewise, like there are times in the past where I was at work and I would want to pray, but I have all my helmet and stuff on, but having my head physically covered isn't I could still pray, right?
Yeah, your head is not covered, Adriano. You have to get that out of your mindset. Yes, you can pray if you have a hat on. That is not what Paul is forbidding. He is forbidding face veiling around women.
Okay. Okay, that makes a lot of sense.
Yes,
okay, thank you.
It sure does. It's freeing. Well, thank God that his laws make sense and are not weird. The Protestants made God out to be so weird, like, don't have something on your head, it's going to block the signal. No, your prayers still go up to God. He does not care if you have just a thing on top of your head. Like, I'm walking through the forest one day, and a leaf falls down on my head. And while I was praying, I just started, suddenly dishonorable to God because I had a thing on my head. No, Paul says do not have a face veil when you're praying. Women, however, he's saying men don't put on a woman's veil when you guys get together as a church. And you women, keep your veil on when you're in the church. Don't imitate the heathen and take off your veil and start acting crazy like those Greek women who would go into these ecstatic frenzies and thinking that they had received some revelation and some spirit was taking hold of them. Keep your veil on. Be modest. That's what he's commanding.
Hey Luke,
Yes.
I heard you say twice that men are not supposed to be veiled around a woman. You said woman specifically, so is it woman specifically or is it in general? Because I thought it's in general.
Paul is rebuking something very specific. You as a man should not be walking around and have a dress style that consists of you veiling your face. That is womanly. But if there were some practical reason for it that was not about style, but for practicality's sake, like if you needed to wear a face mask, if you're doing an operation, you're a doctor, or if you're in a sandstorm and the sand is blowing against you, as men do in Middle Eastern countries, they put something over their face. That is not sinful. But as a fashion style, you're not allowed to dress like a woman and veil yourself. And if you're with a woman in an assembly, it's disgraceful for you to just put on a veil for some religious reason like these crazy people were.
Yeah. Nah, I understand that. Like if it's for a practical reason, then like a blizzard, snowstorm, something like that. But I thought it was just like in general. But I was just I wasn't sure after you had said around a woman because it made it
Um,
sound like you were saying
a
specifically. But
woman wears a veil for a practical reason, to shield her from the eyes of men. It is to be modest and to protect other men from lusting after her, and to show her subjection to her husband by not showing her own face, but letting her husband be her representative. And the man then, he can't be veiling his head around the women. If that's her job, it's to veil herself and let her husband be the representative. If he's veiling his head too, he's saying that he's in subjection to somebody. So he ought not to veil himself around a woman. Unless there's
but
a snowstorm. Look, if there's a big snowstorm, they're not doing it for some perverted reason. They're doing it for a practical reason. If they're covering their faces in a snowstorm.
it's just like in general too, though, right?
Isaiah,
Because
I
like
think I have explained this sufficiently. I've explained it so many times. I thought I was like driving you guys crazy with how many times I've explained it. But I guess this is truly like an idea that's been deeply ingrained. So what are you asking then, Isaiah?
no, like I get all that, but because I know like a veil would be a woman's clothing, but then you keep on saying a man shouldn't veil himself around a woman, which is true, but you keep saying it as in like that's the only specific instance that a man shouldn't be veiled.
Right, that's correct. Yes, a woman, if there are no human beings on the planet, if she's the last human being on the planet, she doesn't have to wear anything at all. And a man, if he's the last human being on the planet, it doesn't matter if he puts anything on his head. Doesn't matter what he's wearing.
Uh-huh. All right, thank you.
Yes. This is a very specific thing that Paul was rebuking. It was a reversing of gender roles and of male and female clothing, which, according to God, is an abomination. So just as it was condemned in the Old Testament, it's condemned still. Men and women are not to exchange dress. Men are not to wear womanish veils, and women are not to expose themselves in public. He says, but the reason in nature why women's hair is called long, because it was given her for a covering, namely to cover her eyes. Because by this sign in nature, woman is taught subjection to man, her husband, the covering of her eyes. So then it is clear from the order of God in nature that man who wears his hair so long that it can be drawn forward, or that it can, by drawing it forward, be made to serve to perform the purpose that God gave women long hair for, to wit, for a covering to cover her eyes, is the long hair. Even nature itself teaches man is a shame to his nature to wear. That's a very long sentence. But you notice how he says, if a man's hair is so long that it can be drawn forward to serve the purpose of a woman's long hair, to cover her face, he says, then that is forbidden. That is a shame to him. Get it? Another person confirming that long hair on a woman is meant to act as a natural veil if she doesn't have a veil on her. Does this make sense, Nolan? Are you pleased, Nolan, to see so many people confirm this that we've been saying?
Absolutely.
We thought we sounded crazy to these people talking about using hair as a natural veil. Well, they all understood this. Okay, who do we have now? Do I even need to put an introduction here? Martin Luther, the founder of the Lutheran denomination and the starter, usually credited as the main instigator in the Protestant Reformation in the 1500s. Martin Luther talks about it. This is his commentary on 1 Timothy. He says, simple garb and adornment is more fitting for a woman than a wagon load of pearls. He says, Paul condemns those women who parade in luxury, who wish to be dressed in the most beautiful clothing to allure lovers day after day, who go about every day as if it were Easter. So he says women apparently would dress fancy clothes on Easter. That's not good. He says, there's one way of dressing for a dance, another way for church. If that were to come, and he talks about the women who are wearing pearls and adorning themselves. He says, if that kind of woman were to come to the sacrament today, I would not permit it. So am I against the pleasure of and passion for dressing. And he says, not for passion or pleasure, but for apparel. That's the purpose of clothing. That is edifying apparel, which offends and traps or scandalizes the eyes of no one. And he says, formerly, in the place where he's living, he says, formerly, women walked about with their neck bared all the way to the middle of the back. This was immodest dress. Elsewhere, and I know they translate it as chest or as a breast here, but I looked it up in the Latin. He wrote this in Latin. But he says, elsewhere, half the chest is seen. They have high-heeled shoes, etc., so that they can they can show off their bodies. And he says, rather, they ought to have clothes to conceal themselves, to cover the neck. Our women, now he's about to brag about his women who are following his Reformation. He says, our women walk about with their faces almost fully veiled, with everything covered, so that almost nothing of their limbs or skin is visible. In church, everything should be concealed, so that one walks with modesty. And then he commentates on what Paul says, women should not dress themselves with gold. He says, with gold means that gold should not be displayed in clothing or veils. It is clear here what the custom of Greek women was, and the rule applies to all. He says, in public life, let everything be veiled. Modest clothing is necessary. This long mantle and veil are greatly commendable. Virgins, however, should not wear garlands or crowns, but a veil, especially when participating in the sacrament. And he says monastic garb comes in here. So, guys, monasticism would just be like the strictest form of Christian living. He says monastic garb comes in here. In this, everything is concealed. This is very modest dress. He says, thus I praise long coats and furs highly, blah, 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 blah. He says, I find no fault. Now, again, I looked up the translation of this. Some of this I'm translating from Latin, so forgive me. But he says, I find no fault in our women. I could bear that young women come with their hair veiled, but this is contrary to custom. There should be modesty in dress. Otherwise, in public, modesty is the rule. I'm not sure what he means by this, that he could bear women veiling their hair, but that this is contrary to custom. I don't know what he means by that. Okay, he has a few more commentaries. He says, for that reason, the wife wears a headdress, that is the veil, on her head, as Paul says in 1 Corinthians. And he says in the second chapter, I think that's his mistake. Either that or somebody translated it incorrectly. I've got the reference if anybody wants to look it up here. He says, the wife veils herself with a fine, soft veil, spun and sewn out of pretty, soft flax or linen. And she does not wind a coarse bunch of woven fabric or a dirty cloth around her head or mouth. And he talks about this, that, why does she cover her mouth? He says, so that if she ever is being annoying to her husband can say, hey, pull the veil up, put it over your mouth. I don't want to hear you right now. Face veil. Face veil. Did you guys hear what he said up here? Martin Luther said. He said, rather, they ought to have clothes to conceal themselves, to cover the neck. And he says, our women walk about with their faces almost fully veiled, with everything covered, so that almost nothing of their limbs or skin is visible. So again, guys, that is the veil we're talking about. That's in Germany. He says, otherwise, and aside from that, the wife should put on a veil. This is another book now. I'm switching to another letter he wrote. The wife should put on a veil just as a pious wife is duty-bound to help bear her husband's accident, illness, and misfortune on account of the evil flesh. He talks about Sarah. He commentates on that part where it says that Sarah was in the tent. Remember, Jesus and the two angels appear to Abraham, and they say, where is Sarah, your wife? And he says, in the tent. And so he's going to commentate on that verse. He says, in the case of Sarah, however, the opposite virtues are given praise in this passage, and this by means of Abraham's brief statement that she is in the tent. He says, thus Paul prescribes in Titus 2:5, remember the part where he says women should be workers at home? He says, Paul prescribes in Titus that a woman should be a domestic, so to speak, one who stays in her own home and looks after her own affairs. The heathen depicted Venus as standing on a tortoise, for just as a tortoise carried its house wherever it creeps, so a wife should be concerned with the affairs of her own home and not go too far away from it. You guys remember Plutarch? He quotes the same thing. He talks about Venus, that ancient statue of Venus standing on a tortoise. And Plutarch used that to prove that women should be veiled completely. Every part of their body, all their skin should be completely veiled, just as a tortoise hides in its house or in its veil. So he's referring to that. And he says that's what it means that Sarah is in the house. She doesn't expose herself to the public. He says, hence it is a great praise for Sarah that on this occasion she tends to her own affairs and does not offend by being curious, but like a tortoise remains in her little shell and does not take the time required to get a brief look at the guests she has and at what kind of guests they are. This modesty and restraint surpass all the acts of worship and all the works of all the nuns, and these words, Sarah is in the tent, should be inscribed on the veils of all matrons. Thus says Martin Luther. Martin Luther will have it so. Okay, here's Johann Bengel. He's writing in the mid-1700s. He is also a Lutheran living in Germany. And he says, he's talking about 1 Corinthians 11:16 in the assembly, blah, 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 that they should veil themselves. And he says, the face is chiefly referred to when he speaks of a covering. Wow. He says, a question arises here. What is to be thought concerning wigs? First, they do not seem to be considered as a covering for the head, for they are an imitation of the hair, and where that is too thin, they supply the defect, and in the present day are sometimes quite necessary for the sake of health. And they no more veil the face than every man's own hair, and even if women were accustomed to wear wigs, they would not be considered as thereby sufficiently covered. So he says they no more veil the face than a man's hair. Notice how veiling the face is the object here. He says the face is chiefly referred to when he speaks of a covering. He says, let the woman cover herself because of the angels, i.e., because the angels are also covered. As the angels are to God, so the woman is to the man. The face of God is manifested, whereas the angels are covered. The face of the man is manifested. The woman is covered. Nor is the man on that account exalted above the angels, but he is merely considered to be, or so far as to represent God in regard to the woman, which cannot be said of the angels. Blah, 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 blah. Okay, here is an Anglican who was born in 1821 and died in 1910. Guys, this is so late. You realize how recently we lost this tradition? This is an Anglican living in Ireland, and we do find that the tradition lasted longest in the East, but in the West, we find, like, especially in America, it disappeared really fast after the Americans colonized the United States. Well, I guess as the British, all the colonizers turned it into what it is. But yeah, in Europe and in the East, people were still veiling, and to this day, many of them are still veiling. But it's all gotten worse and worse over time. So here's an Anglican in Ireland. This is another very famous, one of the most famous Bible commentaries. I didn't even know this, but among Protestants, this is a very famous commentary, Mr. Fawcett. He says, the Corinthian women, on the ground of the abolition of distinction of sexes in Christ, claimed equality with the male sex, and overstepping the bounds of propriety, they came forward to pray and prophesy without the customary head coverings of females. And he says, he dishonors his head, the principal part of the body, by wearing a covering or veil, which is a mark of subjection, and which makes him look downwards instead of upwards to his spiritual head, Christ, to whom alone he owes subjection. Do you guys notice how this veil is something they would drape over their head, and it would hang down? It would cover their head, cover their face. That's why he says it makes him look downwards. And he says, Paul says, dishonors his head, she dishonors her head by being unveiled, in that she acts against the divine ordinance and the modest propriety that becomes her. In putting away the veil, she puts away the badge of her subjection to man, which is her true honor. For through him it connects her with Christ, the head of the man. Moreover, as the head covering was the emblem of maiden modesty before man, and he's quoting Genesis 24, when Rebekah veiled her face, and conjugal chastity, so to uncover the head indicated withdrawal from the power of the husband, whence a suspected wife had her head uncovered by the priest. Yes, yes. Yes, sirree. He says, a woman would not like to be shorn, or what is worse, shaven. But if she chooses to be uncovered in front, let her so also be behind, that is, shorn. You guys notice how he says in front? Because it's a face veil. He says God's face is uncovered. Angels in his presence are veiled. Man's face is uncovered. Woman in his presence is to be veiled. Etc., etc. All right, I won't bore you. We'll just keep going. Here's John Gill, one of the most famous Bible commentators you can find online. Wikipedia says John Gill was the first major writing Baptist theologian, his work retaining influence into the 21st century. So he's a Baptist living in England between 1697 and 1771. And John Gill says, and therefore the man should appear with open face and head uncovered as a token of freedom and boldness, otherwise he dishonors his head, as if his blood and sacrifice were not effectual and his intercession not prevalent. Blah, 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 blah. He says, whereas to be covered as with a woman's veil or hood is effeminate, unmanly, and dishonorable. And he says, for the word is derived not from, and he's giving the Hebrew, to rule or govern or exercise power and authority, but from another Hebrew word, to expand, stretch out, or draw over, as a woman's veil is drawn over her head and face. Moreover, this veiling of the woman in public worship because of angels may be an imitation of the good angels, who, when they sung the praises of God and adored and glorified his perfections, covered their faces. He's quoting Isaiah 6:1. And he says more. He quotes the part in Genesis where Rebekah takes a veil. He says, therefore she took a veil and covered herself, both out of modesty and as a token of subjection to him. He says the Arab women always have veils when they appear in public so that their faces cannot be seen. And though in the summer months they walk abroad with less caution, yet then upon the approach of a stranger they put on their veils. Face veil, face veil, face veil. This is a Baptist. I'm shocked to hear a Baptist has any common sense. But he had some. Here's James Martin Gray, who lived from 1851 to 1935. My goodness, guys, these are some late commentaries. He is an Episcopalian living in the U.S. Shocking. And this is his brief commentary. It's not going to be as good as anything that came before, but listen to what he says. He says, the offense of these women was praying and prophesying with uncovered heads, or rather, unveiled faces, contrary to the custom of the times for both Jews and Gentiles, the head covering being a symbol of the woman's subordination to the man. Here is a man named Paul Kretzmann, living from 1883 to 1965. He is a Lutheran in the USA. Again, guys, I found these from the Study Light website. It has a ton of, I just went through the list, and it gave me all these commentaries. So these are popular ones. Here's Kretzmann's popular commentary of the Bible. He says, the peculiar notion of Christian liberty, which had gained ground in the congregation at Corinth, manifested itself also in this, that the women departed from the custom prevailing in the East, according to which they were obliged to wear veils in public. So you notice how he says this is the custom prevailing in the East? He knows that this is a custom of modesty and that they were abandoning it. This has nothing to do with some symbolic prayer veil. I wonder how many times I'll have to say it. For the people, there's going to be some people watching this video, guys, who are so stubborn. It won't matter how many times we say this. Can you imagine those people really exist? They could hear this entire video and they say, I don't think it's a face veil. I think that's insane. Okay. He says it might therefore also happen that they prayed or prophesied in a public meeting without thereby assuming the leadership. If, in a case of that kind, a woman threw back the veil which covered her face and thus stood with her head uncovered, she put to shame her own head, the dishonor done to the dominant sex falling upon herself. She placed herself upon a level with the free, loose women, the prostitutes, who were so numerous in the Greek cities. He says physical barefacedness led people to make inferences as to the morals of a woman, especially in a city like Corinth, because, guys, there were a lot of prostitutes, and prostitutes never veiled their face. He says, and it was self-evident for a Christian woman to avoid even the appearance of evil. Well, again, it would be evil even if you didn't look like, well, even if you weren't literally a prostitute, because you're not allowed to reveal yourself in public. So, guys, again, this is a Lutheran living in the 1900s, died in 1965, and this commentary was written sometime in the mid 1900s. He knows this is a face veil. Here is Johann Peter Lang, born in 1802, died in 1884. A Calvinist living in Germany. He says, according to the usage of the Greeks, men appeared in public religious service with face and head uncovered. And the case was otherwise with the Romans, and from later times with the Jews. I should highlight this in red. He says, in the Old Testament period, such covering was employed only as a token of deep mourning. So, guys, he knows. God, those are the same verses I was showing you guys, that when men are extremely ashamed, they cover up their face. But he says, according to the usage of the Greeks, men appeared in public religious service with face and head uncovered. I think he might be slightly off there. I already showed a lot of quotes where the Greeks show up with their face actually covered. He thinks it's only the Romans that are covering their face, but I showed it is also the Greeks that cover the face. Whatever. He's mistaken. But at least he understands it's a face covering. He says, the unveiling of the head was an abuse originating in female vanity under the pretext of Christian freedom and of equality with man, and it was so much the more disturbing to devotion as it was contrary to custom to see women unveiled out of the house. And then he quotes the verse where it says, she dishonors her own head. He says, this referred to the man, would yield a good sense even in connection with what follows, inasmuch as the woman, by appearing abroad so shamelessly and exposing herself to the gaze of other men, might bring a blot upon her husband. You see that this is about modesty, not about a symbolic hat. He says he must mean, therefore, the good and holy angels, when he says because of the angels, yet the phrase is not to be construed as expressing an oath which would be contrary to the usage of the language, nor yet does it mean that women should veil their faces in presence of men who are here declared to be the image and glory of God, because angels do this in the divine presence. So he's saying that's not the reason why women veil their face. It has nothing to do with Isaiah 6. I don't know why, if the Isaiah thing has anything to do with why women veil their faces, but you can see he knows it is a face veil. He just doesn't think that the angels are the reason why she should veil her face. Here's another man, Frederick Meyer, born in 1847, died in 1929, another Baptist living in England. This is from F.B. Mayer's Through the Bible Commentary. He says, the women, therefore, must veil their heads in the Christian assemblies as the angels veil their faces in the presence of God. The uncovered face of man is to the glory of God, but the uncovered face of woman recognizes that she finds her glory in her husband's love and care. Here's another guy, Matthew Poole, died in 1679, so he's writing in the late 1600s. He's a nonconformist living in the UK somewhere. I didn't find the specific country. But 1600s, that's pretty old. He says, it being in those places accounted an immodest thing for a woman to appear in public uncovered. It is observed of Rebekah, when she met Isaac, she took a veil and covered herself. And he quotes, and by the way, Rebekah's veil is a face veil. In verse 6, he commentates on when Paul says, but if it be a shame for a woman to be shorn or shaven, let her be covered. And he says, if nature teaches us that it is a shame for a woman to be shorn or shaven, it also teaches us that it is a shame for her to be uncovered, either with her hair or some artificial covering, which latter seems rather to be meant in this place, because divines think, I guess he means the wiser commentators think, that the face is that part of the head which the apostle here intends should be covered in their religious actions, which is not covered with the hair, but with a veil. So he's saying that in the 1600s. He says the thing as to which he would have them judge within themselves, and accordingly pronounce sentence, was whether it was a decent thing for women to pray to God with their hair all hanging loose about their shoulders, or without any veil or covering for their head and face. Here's a Methodist in the USA named Joseph Excel, born in 1849, died in 1920. A Methodist in the USA. That's kind of shocking. If he says anything about a face veil, guys, I mean, that is so late. That is amazing. In the USA, you remember, guys, the Americans are the most stubborn. They're the ones who led the revolt against female modesty. He says to cover the head was to assume openly the woman's condition of subordination and to disavow his manly right to stand with unveiled face before Christ. He says a Corinthian woman's veil would be the peplum, worn over the shoulders in the house and drawn over the face in public. Here's John Trapp, died in 1669. He was a Puritan living in England. He says, some think the apostle argues from the example of the angels, we should imitate their modesty who were wont to cover their faces to testify their subjection toward God. Here's Joseph Benson, died in 1821. He was a Methodist in Europe, in the UK. He says, with a veil, which is a sign of subjection, a man dishonors his head, Christ, who, having made him the head of the woman and given him authority over her, is dishonored when the man renounces that authority by appearing veiled in the presence of the woman as her inferior. So you see, Isaiah, you're asking, is it just around the woman that it's disgraceful? Well, yeah, they understand that to be the main part of the disgrace, perhaps the only part of the disgrace, as so many understand it. This is about a woman not showing her subjection, or a man showing his subjection to a woman. But if there is no man around, she doesn't have to veil herself. Therefore, it follows that a man could veil himself if there's no woman around. There's no reason for him to do it. It'd be stupid. I mean, it'd be irrational. There's no reason to put on a veil at all.
Wait. Well, I can see that because if a woman doesn't have to veil, if there's the people she would have to veil around aren't there, she doesn't have to veil. So vice versa, a man could veil if there isn't woman around.
Right,
But
but
I thought it was just go ahead.
well, and I could only think of a practical reason for him to do that. No religious reason, but the practical reason would just be if you're in a blizzard or a sandstorm or something like that. And you certainly can pray if you have a veil on. A man, if he has, something over his face, that is not a sin. He just cannot wear that as his fashion style, as his type of clothing, and exchange clothing with a woman. That is an abomination.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say because I'm like, if men aren't supposed to wear women's clothing and vice versa, and long hair and veils is a woman's clothing, then wouldn't the man not be supposed to be like veiling just in general? But you said if he's like by himself, but as long as it wasn't a normal thing or like just theoretically.
Theoretically, yes, exactly.
Okay.
So again, Joseph Benson, Methodist in the
Wait,
UK.
real quick, real quick.
Yes.
So, okay, well, yeah, that clears it up because I was confused when you were talking about it earlier, and I was like, dang, I already know what he's saying, but yeah, but that makes more sense. But if it's a woman's clothing, or I guess it's different though. It's different than as if it was long hair or a woman wearing pants or cutting her hair short or something of that nature. Like a man having a veil would be like still a woman's clothing, but like not to the same degree as the aforementioned things, right? Because they'd be able to do those for practical reasons, whereas with the other things, there's not any practical reasons to, like, for a woman to have pants, or for a man to have long hair, or for a woman to have short hair, things like that, right?
Yes, I'm going to just say yes to that. Okay, here is another part. He's going over what it means with her head uncovered, so he's going verse by verse, if you can see that. I should probably put little dashes here. So you can see there's a separation of the verses in each section. So he says the definition of with her head uncovered is without any veil over her head and face. That's the meaning. All right, we go to the next part. I guess just putting a few little dashes here. Hope nobody minds the delay. Anybody have any questions about anything? Okay, we continue. Here's William Burkitt. Again, I'm skipping a lot, but I think you guys get the point. Hey, if anybody feels like that one wasn't a proof text, go ahead and stop me and say, wait, Luke, can you go back to that one and read some more? You guys are probably really bored, though. Okay, here's William Burkitt, writing in the late 1600s. He's an Anglican living in England. He says, by the woman's prophesying with her head uncovered, to the dishonor of her head or husband, is to be understood her appearing unveiled in the church, open and barefaced in public. He says, superstitions, blah, 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 Gentiles served their idols, and particularly when they sacrificed to Bacchus, who used to have their faces uncovered, their hair disheveled, hanging at its full length around about their ears. So yes, he's talking about the women, just as we were saying, the women used to sacrifice to Bacchus, and they used to have their faces uncovered. He says, now the Corinthian women, in imitation of these heathen women, for the female sex is very fond, and exceeding prone to follow the fashion, did cast off their veils, discovering their faces. Okay, we now go to Albert Barnes, writing in the late 1800s. He is a Presbyterian in the USA. Wow. And he talks about, a lot of these guys, once they get to a certain point, once you get to the late 1800s and 1900s, they just start quoting other commentators. So it certainly has less authority, but it does have more. It's just to prove that there was awareness of this, that it was a face veil, even though they're just quoting other commentators. So this guy, Barnes, says, Brett Snyder understands it of a veil as being a defense or guard to the face, lest it should be seen of others. So I don't know who that, I guess that's some German commentator or something, but it's somebody who is correct. He says, the Hebrew name of the veil signifies dependence. Great importance was attached to this part of the dress in the East. All the women of Persia are pleasantly apparelled. When they are abroad in the streets, all, both rich and poor, are covered with a great veil or sheet of very fine white cloth, of which one half, like a forehead cloth, comes down to the eyes, and going over the head, reaches down to the heels, and the other half muffles up the face below the eyes, and being fastened with a pin to the left side of the head, falls down to their very shoes, even covering their hands, with which they hold that cloth by the two sides, so that, except the eyes, they are covered all over with it. So he's writing that in the late 1800s. And he has a commentary on the part where it says, her hair is given to her for a covering. He has a little thing that says margin veil. It is given to her as a sort of natural veil and to indicate the propriety of her wearing a veil. It answered the purpose of a veil when it was allowed to grow long and to spread over the shoulders and I think he meant to say over parts of the face. Before the arts of dress were invented or needed. Here's another man named Charles John Ellicott, who was born in 1819 and died in 1905, so I assume this is being written in the late 1800s. He's an Anglican living in England. He says, the apostle's teaching on this subject is a remarkable illustration of how completely he had overcome his old, oh my goodness, oh, this is painful, all these people. He says, the apostle's teaching on this subject is a remarkable illustration of how completely he had overcome his old Jewish prejudice, and how the whole of his nature had become leavened with the freedom of the gospel. This guy's wicked. This guy's disgusting. For it was the custom amongst the Jews for the man to pray with covered head and the face veiled with the talith as an expression of his unworthiness to speak face to face with God. He says, it was a profound insight into human nature which enabled the apostle to realize how an external symbol would infallibly tend to modify doctrine, and how thus the perpetuating of such a custom in the Christian church might have hindered the full recognition of the great truth of the personal and direct communication of every individual soul with the Father. This guy is so disrespectful. He goes over the verse. Because of the angels, he says, why should a woman have her head covered either with her natural veil or hair or with an artificial veil shrouding her face? Because of the angels. And then he answers the question. But he understands this is a face veil. Well, maybe he's actually not being disrespectful. I'm sorry, guys. I think I'm thinking of another commentary here. There is one that is really disrespectful. No, I think he's right. Paul did overcome his prejudice. But I guess that is only assuming that the Jews were really veiling the face. I'm not sure the Jews were veiling the face. That's not something that many commentators talk about. I don't know if they were doing that. He's taking that probably from the verse where he says that, Paul says, even to this day, when the Jews read the Old Covenant law, a veil lies over their hearts. I'm not sure if that's a veil over their face. Perhaps they were. I don't know. Well, excuse me, I was hasty. But I am thinking of another commentary that's quite disrespectful. I mean, Paul was visited by Christ, and Christ taught him everything. I don't think he was... Maybe it is a little bit disrespectful. Okay, let's go to James Burton Kaufman. He's born in 1905 and died in 2006. This is a commentary they had on the website. I'm not sure how popular this actually is, but hey, I took it. Here it is. It's a guy in the Church of Christ, and he lives in the USA. Again, guys, this isn't because of this commentary has authority. That's not why we're quoting it. It's just to show general awareness that this is a face veil. So in his commentary on 1 Corinthians 11, he says, what was the veil, actually, that was worn in those days? It was a large, loose mantle, which the woman wrapped around her head and face, leaving only the eyes visible, and sometimes only one eye. There you go. Here's William Robertson Nichol, who was born in 1851 and died in 1923. He's part of the Scottish Free Church in Scotland. He says the regulation is not limited to those of either sex who pray or prophesy, but such activity called attention to the apparel, and doubtless it was amongst the more demonstrative women that the impropriety occurred. In the excitement of public speaking, the shawl might unconsciously be thrown back. And then he goes over the words kephiles, which is, Paul says the man should not have anything coming down from the head. He says, the practice being for the women in going out of the house to throw the upper fold or lappet of her robe over her head so as to cover the brow. So this guy is also recognizing that it hangs down over the face, over the brow. And he says, amongst the Greeks, only the heterae, meaning the prostitutes, so numerous in Corinth, went about unveiled. Slave women wore the shaved head also, a punishment of the adulteress. Oh, also a punishment of the adulteress. Yeah, the adulteresses were shaved. He says, if a woman prefers a bare head, she should remove her hair. Womanly feeling forbids the latter, then it should forbid the former, for the like shame attaches to both. The argument appeals to, I'm not sure what he means, GR, and Greek. The argument appeals to Greek and Eastern sentiment. Physical barefacedness led to the inference of moral in a city like Corinth. Wait, do I already have this one? Do I already have this? Oh no, I get it, guys. He's quoting other commentators. I told you guys. Once you get to like the late 1800s or early 1900s, they just stop writing their own words and they're just quoting other commentators. Anyway, this shows that they're aware it's a face veil, even if he's not saying anything new. Here's Roderick Ice, another guy in the Church of Christ. Again, no authority, just showing awareness. He says, at Corinth, decent women wore a face veil which covered both their head and face. While teaching in public, these women had thrown off their face veils like the prostitute priestesses in the idol temples. He says, at Corinth, a man who prayed or spoke God's message with his head covered with a face veil would disgrace Christ. And he says, if doing that would disgrace her, taking off her veil, then she should wear the face veil. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, cutting her hair. If she would do that, then she should wear the face veil. He says at Corinth the face veil was symbolic of being lower in rank. In this whole section, we must remember Paul deals with Eastern ideas of the relationship of men and women. So he's saying this doesn't apply to us. This is just Paul's idea of Eastern practices. He says, at Corinth, a woman wore a face veil everywhere except the privacy of her own home to show she was under the man's authority. This custom has been kept up in Arab lands until just recently. And he says they argued that Christian freedom allowed the women who prayed and spoke God's message in public worship to do this without wearing the face veil. Here's a guy named Mark Dunagan, another guy from Church of Christ. And he published this in 2005. Yeah, he says the same thing. It's a face veil. This is funny, actually. I got to read this. I'm sorry, I was misremembering some of these commentaries. That's why I blasted that guy. I must not be hasty. I must be slow to blast people. I don't think that guy was being that disrespectful. I think he was being a little disrespectful, but I called him wicked, and I'm not sure that was quite wicked. I regret it. Okay, but we're about to hear some pretty crazy commentaries. As we get closer to the end of all these commentaries, we're going to hear people acknowledging that it was a face veil, but we're going to hear commentaries which are increasingly more modern, and they're going to start being really critical of the idea of a face veil. And it just amplifies in insanity and just a rebellious spirit. So listen to this guy. He says, in New Testament times, among both Greeks and Romans, reputable women wore a veil in public, and to appear without it was an act of bravado, or worse. And he says Tarsus, Paul's home city, was especially noted for strictness in this regard. What? Tarsus? Where is he getting that? He's like, this is Paul's personal issue. Paul is like, he's really big on these face veils because he came from Tarsus. And guys, I'm almost certain he's referring to Dio Chrysostom. Again, this is a pagan. This is not the same as John Chrysostom, who lived like 400 years later. No, Dio Chrysostom talks about that. Remember in the Dio Chrysostom quote where he says, and yet many of the customs still in force reveal in one way or another the sobriety and severity of deportment in those earlier days. He says, which, they still have in Tarsus. He talks about the governor of Tarsus. That's the only thing I can think of. That's the only thing that this guy might be referring to that I know of, and I've done a lot of research on the subject. But man, this guy's a real conspiracy theorist, making it out like Paul is just enforcing his personal bias because he came from Tarsus. But no, we see people are doing the face veil everywhere in the world, not just Tarsus. What in the world is he talking about? He says, probably some women in Corinth were urging that if the Spirit moved them to speak, they must speak. And how could they speak with their faces veiled? Yeah, and I don't know if that is the reason. I don't think that's why they're taking it off. I think they're taking it off because that was some weird thing that the demons induced them to do. Here's a guy who was born in 1834 and died in 1922. He's a Presbyterian in the USA. He says the Greek women rarely appeared in public, but lived in strict seclusion. Unmarried women never quitted their apartments, except on occasions of festal processions, either as spectators or participants. Even after marriage, they were largely confined to the gyneconitis, or women's rooms. Thus, Euripides says, as to that which brings the reproach of a bad reputation upon her who remains not at home, giving up the desire of this, I tarried in my dwelling. I suppose probably a woman was saying that. And he also quotes Menander saying, the door of the court is the boundary fixed for the free woman. So he's saying even a free woman who's not a slave, she is never allowed to go beyond her court, which has a wall around it. This is a big wall around her house. Remember I kept telling you guys, that was how people used to have houses. I know that even up until like the 1600s, I know that they still had houses like that in Europe. He says the headdress of Greek women consisted of nets, hair bags, or kerchiefs, sometimes covering the whole head. A shawl which enveloped the body was also often thrown over the head, especially at marriages or funerals. I think this guy has a little bit more to learn. I'm glad he appeals to what the Greeks are wearing, and he sees the connection here that this is what Paul is also referring to. But you can see, the ignorance is increasing as we get to the 1900s. And I say that in reference to him saying, oh, they did this especially at marriages or funerals. You guys know that that's completely absurd. veiling the face was not something especially done at marriages or funerals. It was if women were ever in public. Here's Daniel Whitby, born in 1638, died in 1726. This is a guy who hated Calvinism. That's what he's known for, attacking Calvinism. And he's a Protestant living in England. And he says, for that the apostle speaks not of prophesying at home, but in the church, is evident from the apostle's argument. So he says, whatever Paul is saying, this is not talking about doing things in private. This is talking about in public. He says, it was also customary for the Jewish woman to go veiled. Moreover, for this cause ought the woman to have power or a veil upon her head because of the evil angels, she being tempted by the prince of them to do that which is a perpetual cause of shame to her, and which increased her subjection to the man, ought therefore to use this token of shamefacedness and subjection. And he goes over this part where he says a veil because of she ought to have a veil upon her head because of the angels. He says that all the ancient interpreters agree in this. That which we render power signifies a veil or covering, which being put over her head compels her to hang down her eyelids. And 'tis here, say they, called power, as being the token of the power and dominion of the man over her. And he says that among the 9 maledictions of the women, which the Jews reckon up, so apparently, guys, the Jews have 9 things they have against, like sins that women, I don't know. What are the 9 maledictions of women? I'll have to look that up. But he says, among the 9 maledictions of women, which the Jews reckon up, this is one, that she is to have her head covered like one that mourns. And this, they say, she is to wear not so much as a token of subjection as of shame. Whence Philo calls the cover of the woman's head the symbol of her shame. And this shame, say they, is due to her because she brought the first sin into the world. It is with her, they say, as when one transgresses and is ashamed, and therefore she comes forth with her head covered. She ought, says Tertullian, by her habit to resemble Eve, a mourner and a penitent for the shame of the first sin. Hence he often interprets this text of evil angels. Interesting. And Tertullian does say that. He does say that Christian women ought to act like Eve, who mourned over sin, and they ought to imagine themselves all as an Eve, and that they ought to imagine if they were Eve, they would have done the same thing. So the women must be in a constant state of avoiding that sin which Eve was guilty of, which was leading her husband into sin. Rather, women take the back seat and they accept they are not going to be the leaders. They're going to let the husband lead, and that is a protection to them. If they always cover themselves and they say, husband, I am in subjection to you. I'll just keep going. I think that's sufficient. He appeals to Tertullian. We all know that that is a face veil. He says, here's Robertson, A.T. Robertson, who was born in 1863, died in 1934. He is a Baptist living in the U.S., and he says, having his head covered, blah, 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 literally having a veil or a kaluma. A kaluma is understood, hanging down from the head. So, guys, he knows it's a kaluma. By the way, it's a face veil. Everybody knows that. He says, let her cover herself up with the veil that is down, kata, the Greek says kata, the veil hanging down from the head. And he says, who would be shocked at the conduct of the women, since the angels themselves veiled their faces before Jehovah? All right, let's look. John Calvin, founder of, well, a few denominations, but especially the Presbyterians, who are the biggest fans of John Calvin. What a shock. Does John Calvin teach the face veil? Let's find out. He says, with the view of proving that it is an unseemly thing for women to appear in a public assembly with their heads uncovered. Emphasis on public assembly. I have a lot of commentary in here that I pasted, but I'm just going to go over the red stuff. He says, in this reply there is nothing amiss, though at the same time it might suit sufficiently well to say that the apostle requires women to show their modesty, not merely in a place in which the whole church is assembled, but also in any more dignified assembly, either of matrons or of men, such as are sometimes convened in private houses. So he says, even if you're in a private house, if somebody's coming over, she should be veiled. You notice how, in his mind, this has nothing to do necessarily with praying? But let's hear what he says. He says, for this cause ought the woman to have power on her head. From that authority he draws an argument in favor of outward decorum. She is subject, says he. Let her then wear a token of subjection. In the term power, there is an instance of metonymy, for he means a token by which she declares herself to be under the power of her husband, and it is a covering, whether it be a robe or a veil or any other kind of covering. Now, I can hear somebody take this part, which I have here in the Latin, and say, oh, that's not necessarily a face veil. Okay, let's see, guys. Remember, you can take a robe or veil. Sometimes it's this word kerchief, and they can say, handkerchief, that's not very big, that's not large. Well, they have some pretty large kerchiefs. Let's see. Let's keep reading and see if it sounds like he thinks it's a face veil. He says, it is asked whether he speaks of married women exclusively, blah, blah, blah. He says, no, that would be a mistake. This is applicable to virgins also. So he doesn't think it's only married women. It's everybody, all the women. And then he goes over the verse where Paul says, does not nature itself teach you? You should be veiling. He says again, Paul, sets forth nature as the mistress of decorum, and what was at that time in common use by universal consent and custom, even among the Greeks, he speaks of as being natural. Okay, guys, that is the end of the argument. He appeals to what the Greeks are doing. We know that the Greeks were veiling the face. But let's see if we can get Calvin to actually say it's a face veil. He reckons as nature a custom that has come to be confirmed. Or here's an alternate translation. He gives the appellation of nature to this custom, already confirmed by length of time and common use. And then he goes over this part. He goes over Abraham and Abimelech, when his wife Sarah is given back to Abraham, and Abimelech says to Sarah, Abraham, your husband, is a covering to the eyes. He is to you a covering for the eyes. And he says, but what follows is more obscure. He shall be a veil to you. So that's interesting. He just translated as, he shall be a veil to you. He says, for Sarah is taught that the husband to whom she is joined was as a veil with which she ought to be covered, lest she should be exposed to others. Well, case closed. This is about being seen by other people. The veil is supposed to completely conceal the woman. He says, Paul says that the veil which the woman carries on her head is the symbol of subjection. This also belongs to unmarried persons, as referring to the end for which the sex is ordained. I therefore thus explain the words, you, if you had no husband, would be exposed to many dangers. But now, since God has appointed for you a guardian of your modesty, it behooves you to conceal yourself under that veil. Why then have you of your own accord thrown off this covering? He's saying that that's basically what Abimelech is saying. He's saying God has given you a husband so that you'd have a guardian of your modesty. So it behooves you, it compels you to conceal yourself under that veil. He says Moses also says that she took a veil. This is now referring to Sarah. This is a separate commentary. Moses also says that she took a veil, which was a token of shame and modesty. And he says, when it is said that Potiphar's wife cast her eyes upon Joseph, the Holy Spirit, by this form of speech, admonishes all women that if they have chastity in their heart, they must guard it by modesty of demeanor. For on this account also they bear a veil upon their heads, that they may restrain themselves from every sinful allurement. Not that it is wrong for a woman to look at men, but Moses here describes an impure and dissolute look. So you notice how the veil then helps protect them from looking at men. Why? Because it's over their face. Or at least it's all around their face. Perhaps hanging down over their brow and causing them to look down, as all the church fathers say. He says that the woman may be more afraid of perjuring herself. She is presented before God with her head uncovered too, as if the priest would drag her from her lurking place. That seems to me, guys, to absolutely be him confirming he knows this is a face veil. Her lurking place, that's like when you're hidden somewhere. It's not talking about something on the back of your head. He says, Paul, on a very trifling point, sets before our eyes the law of nature. For when he teaches that it is shameful and indecorous for women to appear in public without veils, he desires them to consider whether it would be decent for them to present themselves publicly with their heads shorn. Again, this is about decency. Okay, you guys are probably really bored, and you're like, oh my goodness, Luke, it's almost midnight. Does this ever stop? All right, I'm sorry, guys. I'm sorry to torture you. Would you like to hear some insane? I'm just going to skip, all right? I'm just going to skip. We're going to go down here and hear some insanity. Who wants to hear some insanity? Almost everybody's going to bed now. Look at that. So many people are gone. That's okay. I'm going to read now some extremely rebellious and wicked commentaries from people who fight against the face veil. Here we go. I found this. Is this a Catholic? No. Okay, this is an introduction. This is done by a Protestant named Edgar J. Goodspeed. He died in 1962. And this is a little introduction he made for 1 Corinthians. His introduction on the first letter to the Corinthians. Listen to what he says. This was the wicked commentary that I was about to be up in arms about. But it wasn't that other guy. It's this guy that I was thinking of. He says, but old... Now, he's talking about Paul. He's about to talk about how, Paul is finally learning the reality of things and that Paul's kind of slow. But Paul's, he's figuring it out. And, if only Paul had lived in modern times, he would have realized how unnecessary it is to veil yourself. He says, Paul had already come to see that in union with Christ, differences of sex no longer mattered. Oh, really? He says, but old social inheritances are not easily cast aside. And it still seemed to him indecent for a woman to appear in church without a veil, not indeed over her face, but on her head and shoulders. Really? It's not a face veil? I see. He says, how men, and especially women, should conduct themselves in church was a matter that gave rise to a whole series of questions at Corinth. One was whether women should wear veils in Christian meetings. And he says, Paul was a Jew by education. Guys, this is supposed to be a Christian pastor saying this. He says, Paul was a Jew by education, and women had no part in Jewish worship. It was carried on by the men and boys. Even to this day, in Orthodox Jewish synagogues, the women witnessed the service from a gallery or from behind a screen. In Herod's temple, the women could not advance beyond their own court into the court of the men of Israel. But through the influence of the mystery cults and other forces, women in the Greek world had more freedom and a greater place in religion, and capable Greek women in Corinth felt quite equal to taking part with the men in the meetings. I love how he just talks about how, well, Paul's just, he's got this old social inheritance. It's not easy to cast aside, like Paul needs to. He needs to get with the program. And it still seemed to him indecent for a woman to appear without a veil. Wow, the disrespect. Here is a Catholic. This is called A Catholic Commentary of Holy Scripture, released in 1954, and the editor was Bernard Orchard, and he got a big green light from the Catholic Church to make this. He's going to talk about what it means that women are not to be bareheaded at worship. He says, St. Paul affirms two things: that the male sex has a certain right to precedence, and number two, that therefore it is improper for women to be bareheaded at worship. To us, this seems very illogical, but no doubt it was the general custom in the eastern provinces that women should always have the head covered in the presence of men, except men of their own family, and it was Paul's rule that established customs, if not sinful, should be scrupulously observed. Hence the heat and bluntness of his language. Modern custom is less strict, and St. Paul would no doubt have written differently today. He was certainly no woman-hater. Wow.
The other one is so funny because imagine writing the Corinthian women and they were like, nah, Paul's just slow.
He's a woman-hater. Can you believe him? He says Paul would no doubt have written differently today. He was certainly no woman hater. So if Paul were to just write exactly the same, you would say he is a woman hater? You see how little respect these people have for the apostles? This isn't about the church fathers, guys. This is about a fundamental lack of fear of God and no respect for his apostles. This guy's writing in 1954. I mean, my goodness, look how much things have changed in such a short amount of time. This guy goes on to explain what kind of a veil it was. He says the most common headgear of women was a portion of the outer garment the himation, drawn up from behind over the head. It was easily and quickly done. It could be made to cover the face, too, but that was not usual. Oh, really? Wow. You just get to rewrite history, don't you? All by yourself. This is a commentary on the first epistle to the Corinthians by C.K. Barrett. He was born in 1917 and died in 2011. This is a Methodist in the UK. So he just died recently. He knows better now. And he explains here in 1 Corinthians 11. He says, every man who prays, that is, in public, as any Christian might do in the assembly, or prophesies with a veil, and he says throughout this paragraph, veil is always a paraphrase, since the Greek word kaluma does not occur, is to be understood as a head covering concealing the hair and upper part of the body, not as a covering for the face. And he says, so says some guy named Schlatter, who shows that the reference is to the practice of the devout and modest Jewess. And he says, who transgresses Jewish custom? If she goes out with her head uncovered. So he quotes the exact same part from the Talmud that I was quoting. But guys, that Talmud quote is clearly about a face veil. What a stubborn man. He's trying to disprove something by quoting the Talmud, and yet that quote from the Talmud is about covering the head, not the hair. Wow. Not as a covering for the face, he says. Wow, well, you're a genius, Mr. I was born in 1917 and died in 2011. You learned everything. You made everybody surrender to you with your stupid commentary. Here's a guy who was born in 1863 and died in 1945. He's a Protestant living in England. His name is George Campbell Morgan, and he made a book called Morgan's Exposition on the Whole Bible. He says the question of wearing a veil is of no permanent importance. Not wearing a covering for the head in this country has not the significance that it had in Corinth. Wow. All right then, George. Here's a guy named Gary Hampton. He's Church of Christ, and he's still alive. Hampton's commentary on selected books. He says, while today a veil would not indicate anything to the general populace, Christian women still need to show their subjection to their husbands. A proper spirit is a necessary part of a woman's spiritual attire. So it's about the spirit. You can be wearing immodest clothing, but as long as your spirit is right, that's what really matters. I love how he says, if we were to wear a veil today, that wouldn't indicate anything to the general populace. Well, he's ignorant of the fact that it was a face veil. If a woman wears a face veil in the general populace today, that absolutely indicates something. They will think, whoa, that husband is some extremist. He's probably abusive, having so much power over his wife as to make her cover herself completely in public. See, that attire, the meaning of that attire has not changed. Everybody knows that if a man's wife is covered, he exercises authority over her. So he's mistaken. That would mean
Yeah, and
something.
something I realized, most of these people in the late 1900s, it's mostly about, you see how the culture changed, where once it was unacceptable for a woman not to be unveiled. For, yeah, and in the 1900s, you see that you know woman veiling is just it's just not with the times.
Yep, it was just the times that changed. It's amazing how long it lasted, though. Is that not amazing? I'm not sure which is more amazing, though, the fact that it lasted for so many centuries, even up until the 1800s, or, which this might be even more crazy, that all of mankind, at least most of mankind now, has forgotten about it and thinks that this is a Muslim practice. And they have completely forgotten all of history, and history has been rewritten. Where if you suggest to someone that Paul is talking about a face veil, they're going to say, "Are you crazy?" Like that man who spoke to us recently. I hope he repents. I hope he is saved. But we're still going to, mention the fact that people talk like him, and they say, "I've been a Christian for 20 years. I've never heard that it's a face veil. You're insane." And they're serious. They're not joking around. They really think you're completely out of your mind to suggest that. And yet there's so much evidence for it. If I were to show it to anybody, if I were even to show the tiniest little fraction of evidence, they'd say, okay, that's so much, I'm overwhelmed, just stop it. You really expect me to sit there for hours and listen to quotes from commentaries throughout all the centuries saying it's a face veil? I don't have enough time to do that. Well, that's why we're doing this video, so so we can shut people up.
Just listening to you, it's not a matter of evidence now. It's just a matter your heart is in the right place to accept these.
Yes. But I'm still gathering more evidence. We're trying to condescend to people who are hard-hearted. We want them to be completely overwhelmed. This should be overwhelming, but hey, I'm going to keep going. I've got a lake of evidence. I want an ocean of evidence. Here's another guy, Daniel Whedon. Now, he's living in the late 1800s. He's a Methodist, but he's in the USA, guys. And although we found a lot of commentaries in the 1800s saying, oh, this is a face veil and women should even still do it, nevertheless, you also have people who in the late 1800s are against it, and usually it's these people in the USA, because by that point, they'd separated from Europe and from the East, so they were more separated and ignorant of the customs that the whole world used to practice. They call the U.S. the New World for a reason, because it's a whole new world with brand new traditions. All the old traditions are lost in the USA. So here's Whedon's commentary on the Bible. He goes over the verse, with her head uncovered. He says, before the gaze of masculinity is often at once the modesty and the dignity of woman to veil herself. That unrestrained gaze is often profane, and it is a divine reserve that shrinks and conceals from it. He actually he's confirming it. I wonder if I need to move this to a different section. He says, by most divine law, each sex is confined to its own nature. It is equally shameful for manhood to become effeminate and for womanhood to become masculine. He says, the covering of the head as a sign of womanly modesty before man was a rigid point with the Jews. Oh, and he goes over the story of Kimhit. Remember, the woman who had 7 of her sons admitted to the high priesthood because she covered her entire body, and even indoors she would veil herself. This is a good one. I need to move this up. Oh, okay, never mind. Maybe he is insane. He says, of course, the apostle at the present day would not consider the hood as possessing any religious significance, nor is it any religious obligation that requires her to wear a bonnet in church or forbids her to speak or pray with her bonnet off. But really, Paul condemned the uncovered female head of his day because it then expressed the moving of woman from her sphere and suggested a dishonoring association calculated to bring the purity of the church into suspicion. Wow. Is that so? Is that so? He says, perfectly accordant with all this is Bengal. So remember we quoted Bengal. He lived far before him. But he says, if perfectly in alignment with what Bengal thought, that as angels veil their faces before God, so would they require that the female face should veil before men. Harmony and order should prevail in their angelic presence. So on the one hand, he acknowledges this is a face veil, but then he says, Paul wouldn't require this these days. Really? Here's a man named William Barclay, born in 1907, died in 1978. Church of Scotland in Scotland. Guys, this is some huge, radio commentator or something. You can look him up. He's a really famous guy. He's an author. He's a broadcaster and television presenter in the Church of Scotland. I guess he was their main guy for a long time, a number of years. Very famous teacher in Scotland. Anyway, he says, this is one of these passages which have a purely local and temporary significance. They deal with a situation which has long since ceased to have any relevance for us. Paul's answer was bluntly this: the veil is always a sign of subjection worn by an inferior in the presence of a superior. It is very improbable that in the 20th century we are likely to accept this view of the inferiority and subordination of women. We must remember, the place of the veil is in the East. To this day, Eastern women wear the yasmak, which is a long veil leaving the forehead and the eyes uncovered, but reaching down almost to the feet. In Paul's time, The eastern veil was even more concealing. It came right over the head with only an opening for the eyes and reached right down to the feet. A respectable Eastern woman would never have dreamed of appearing without it. Writing in Hastings' Dictionary of the Bible, T.W. Davies said, "No respectable woman in an Eastern village or city goes out without it, and if she does, she is in danger of being misjudged. Indeed, English and American missionaries in Egypt told the present writer," so he's saying some English and American missionaries told him, William Barclay, "that their own wives and daughters, when going about, find it often best to wear the veil." So, guys, if they go in Eastern countries, they've got to veil because it's expected, even in the 1960s and 70s, I guess. Now, we know that about the Eastern countries. It's just in the U.S. and in Europe, the veil started to disappear in the 1800s and 1900s. He says, "In Oriental lands, the veil is the power and honor and dignity of the woman. With the veil on her head, she can go anywhere in security and profound respect. She is not seen. It is a mark of thoroughly bad manners to observe a veiled woman in the street. She is alone. The rest of the people around are non-existent to her, as she is to them. She is supreme in the crowd. But without the veil, the woman is a thing of naught, whom anyone may insult. A woman's authority and dignity vanish along with the all-covering veil that she discards." And he says, "In the East, then, the veil is all-important. It does not only mark the inferior status of a woman, it is the inviolable protection of her modesty and chastity." So this guy knows all this, and yet he says, well, this is, he says it's very improbable that anybody would accept this view. And he says this is one of those passages that has a purely local and temporary significance. Wow, what audacity for him to say that. Here is Henry Mahan, a Baptist commentator. Again, this was on the website. I feel that this website is a Protestant website, so they have a lot of Protestant commentaries. And here's one from a guy who was born in 1926, died in 2019. So he was an old guy when he wrote this. He's a Baptist in the USA. He says, "Interpreters rightly agree that this and the following verses are to be interpreted in the light of the customs of countries as long as the principles of the Scriptures are not violated or compromised. In those Eastern countries, it signified either shame or subjection for a person to be veiled. A woman never appeared in public without a covering on her head and a veil on her face. If she did, it was an act of rebellion against authority and a demand for equality socially with men. This is not true in our generation." That doesn't even make sense, Henry. Of course it's still true. If you were to put a veil on the face of a woman in this generation, she would say, "I feel like I'm under subjection." I think what he means to say is this isn't required here. It is still true in every generation, but it's just not really a requirement anymore. I see. Here is a website. Oh my goodness. Have you guys ever been to the Head Covering Movement website? There's this huge website called the Head Covering Movement, and they try to convince everybody to wear a stupid pancake, and they've got all these beautiful women in makeup all over this website. And they've got all these books they're selling. Like, you can't avoid women all over this page. It is ridiculous. In full painted prostitute attire. And guys, they have the audacity to answer questions. Like on one part, they're asked, "Hey, should we wear Muslim head coverings? Is that allowed?" And they say, "Yeah, we know a lot of people that wear Muslim head coverings, but we personally, we wouldn't recommend it because people are going to think you're a Muslim." And listen to this article. There's probably even more insane articles, but listen to the name of this article they published on the head covering movement. Again, guys, these people dare to quote the church fathers and say, "We are returning to the ancient customs." They're like, we have so many quotes. Look at how many quotes they have. They've got tons of quotes. They have tons of quotes from church fathers and various people throughout history, including almost every single person that I just showed you. They have quotes from those people saying, "Look, these people are saying the head covering is important," and yet they never mention that it is a face veil. None of them mention that. Can you believe that? The total lying nature of these people. Let's see if we can get some quotes on this website. It's a crazy website. So many women. These people are obsessed with exposing women. But you can look it up sometime. How many quotes they have from all the church fathers? You know, they'll have Tertullian, Clement of Alexandria, guys, adamant about the face veil, and they'll say, "See, the church fathers want you to wear a pancake. Look at all those women. I mean, it's just outrageous, outrageous." But look at the title of this article: "Head coverings and face shapes: How to find a look that flatters." In this article, let's take a look at different hair and head covering styles, or how a different hair and head covering styles can help bring out the best in different face shapes. Step 1, which face shape do I have? So they say first figure out your face shape. Step 2, which hair and head covering styles flatter my face shape? Can you believe this? They want you to actually increase your beauty. Like, this is an ornament. This is just a thing to really bring out how pretty you are. Can you believe these people, by taking a custom delivered by Paul and twisting it, have accomplished the exact opposite purpose of the veil? And David Berceau says the same thing. Here's another website, headcoverings.org. Now, this was quite amazing. This guy, I could actually spend all night on this guy. This guy wrote this huge book on head coverings, and he's saying, we need to get back to head covering. And again, he, like the others, like David Berceau and the head covering movement and other people online, quotes the church fathers back and forth so much it would make your head spin. This is the website I'm thinking of, right? Let me make sure this is the right one. Yeah, this guy. This guy has a big book. He's like, download my book. Why I wrote the book. And in it, he is quoting Tertullian over and over and over again, and yet he doesn't acknowledge the kind of veil that all of the ancients understood. He has chapter 12, What constitutes a head covering? He says, this subject comes logically after one decides that the woman must wear a covering in worship. Unfortunately, many have tried to prejudice people by saying that 1 Corinthians 11 required women to wear a covering which covered the face, or which was big enough to hold a large amount of grain. I am afraid that these assertions have been made in order to make people recoil in amused disgust from the whole idea that a woman must wear a covering in worship. So he's saying people have invented this idea. They've made these assertions in order to actually make you not want to wear a veil. People, he says, I've heard people assert that it's a face veil, and they're doing this to try to get you not to veil. Can you believe how satanic that is? A guy writes an article, or writes a book, makes an entire website called headcoverings.org, tries to convince you to listen to the church fathers and to veil, but not to wear a face veil. Can you believe that? He starts his chapter saying, what constitutes a head covering? He says, not a face veil. Wow. Unbelievable. Here's Roger Pierce. He has a really great website called Tertullian.org. It's such a cool website. It's got tons of church fathers on there. But he talks about Tertullian. I came across this randomly. I was looking up the Latin of Tertullian's book on the veiling of virgins, and he had some notes on it. And so he left these notes. And he says, Tertullian suggests that unmarried women, other than children, should be veiled in church, just as adult women are. And he says, note, here's a little note. He says, note, was the veil over the face or just the hair? And he says, the female veil did not cover the face. The custom of veiling the complete head was current in contemporary Arabia, as Tertullian remarks, and can be seen from contemporary depictions. However, in Carthage, the issue was the veil as depicted in portraits in contemporary society. No full discussion of the custom in antiquity exists. No full discussion? What is he talking about? There are tons of discussions about this. Tertullian's discussion is a full discussion. Clement of Alexandria's discussion is a full discussion. John Chrysostom's discussion is a full discussion. Ambrose. Who else? Jerome, he discusses it at length. How does he say there's no full discussion of veiling in antiquity? What is he talking about? He says this total covering, including the face, is not the subject of the Carthaginian argument. Tertullian labels that as barbaric and considers it excessive. What? 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 Can you believe this? This is Tertullian on the face veil. He said, God bids you be veiled. I believe he does so for fear that the heads of some should be seen. So perilous a face, then, ought to be hidden. For who will have the audacity to intrude with his eyes upon a shrouded face? A shroud means a big covering wrapped around your face. He says the total covering, including the face, is not the subject of the Carthaginian argument. Tertullian labels that as barbaric and considers it excessive. What? Tertullian thinks that's excessive? What planet is this man living on? Words just cannot do this insanity justice. Okay, maybe another time I'll go over this other insane man who wrote an entire book about it, about why you need to veil, but that it's not a face veil. This guy goes to town. I've never seen anybody write so much. Look at how much I wrote in response to this guy. So much. It's outrageous. He fights. He made war against the face veil while making a book trying to convince you to wear a veil. I can't believe it. But it's 12:02. We're going to go to bed. Guys, this is satanic. Satan is trying to rewrite history and get women to stop covering themselves as they ought to, and as they did for thousands of years. I hope you're edified and encouraged. I hope you're invigorated. I hope you have become angered by the things you've read. And I hope that you're more motivated than ever to find, if you're a man, to find a wife who will dress modestly. And if you're one of our Christian sisters, you're very dear to us. We admire you very much for dressing modestly and going against this evil culture. God's blessing is on you, and you have all of our respect, all of our admiration, to show such humility and to show such love and regard for other people, your brothers, and for all people, that you don't want to lead anyone to stumble, and that you embrace your role as a woman, and you will receive great rewards in heaven, and you will have perfect equality in heaven, just as anyone who in this life had to be subordinate, or like a child who maybe while he died as a child, he never became an adult man. He is perfectly equal in heaven. All of us will be equal in heaven. You won't have that kind of lordship anymore of one man lording it over another. But during this life, we must embrace our roles of authority, that there are subordinates and there are authorities. So with that, I think we're going to go to bed then. You're welcome, Isaiah. Hope you're edified. God be with you all. Good night, guys.